He risked his life to save a woman in danger, but he never expected what he would discover. When he visits her in the hospital, a shocking secret changes everything. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Jesse Brown woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, beads of sweat gathering on his forehead. He lay still for a moment, trying to push away the remnants of the nightmare that had just seized him. In the dream, he was once again trapped in a burning house with walls of flame closing in. The haunting echo of his younger brother Todd's voice still rang in his ears. When he finally sat up, Jesse realized he had clenched his fists so tightly that his nails had left small crescent marks on his palms. He got out of bed and moved through his modest apartment, flicking on the soft light by the kitchen counter. The cramped layout barely changed since he'd first rented it 3 years ago, soon after his divorce. A single framed photograph of Todd stood on a narrow shelf near the window. Jesse found his gaze drifting toward it, recalling the day it was taken, both of them smiling at a family picnic, unburdened by fear or regret. The memory of Todd's laughter clashed with the guilt Jesse still harbored for not being able to save him from that terrible fire years ago. His firefighter's jacket hung by the door, a symbol of the life he had chosen. Always ready to protect others, but never quite able to protect himself from the past. Jesse was well respected in the Boston Fire Department. His colleagues, especially his captain, Warren McAllister, saw him as a determined professional. Yet Jesse remained distant, keeping people at arm's length. He believed he didn't deserve anyone's closeness, not after failing to save Todd. Even his marriage to Linda Campbell had disintegrated under the weight of that guilt. Feeling restless, Jesse decided there was no point in trying to sleep again. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and stood by the window, where city lights flickered in the distance. Outside, the street was quiet, just the faint sound of traffic echoing. Sometimes he thought about calling his parents, if only to hear their voices. But he had convinced himself they still blamed him, just as he blamed himself. He switched on the TV to fill the silence and caught a late-night news segment about an uptick in local accidents and fires as colder weather settled in. His stomach tightened at the thought of another distress call. The adrenaline rush of responding to emergencies was the only thing that made him feel useful, yet it always dragged him back to that night with Todd. He could do everything right now. He could follow every safety rule, every protocol, and still, he feared a moment might come when he'd fail once more. Jesse's cell phone buzzed, startling him. He glanced at the screen, a text from a colleague, Sarah Mitchell, one of the paramedics at the station. She had become a friendly presence, though Jesse had resisted her attempts at deeper conversation. The text read, "Can't sleep either. We've got an early shift. Get some rest if you can." He typed a terse reply. "I'll try, thanks." But he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. As he set the phone aside, he felt that old weight pressing on his chest, the same weight he'd felt every night since Todd's death. It made him wonder if he would ever truly move on. An hour later, dawn lightened the sky. Jesse showered, then methodically dressed in his civilian clothes, jeans, a well-worn gray t-shirt, and a flannel shirt over it. Before leaving, he paused by Todd's photo again. Some mornings he would utter a silent apology, as though Todd could hear him. Today, no words came, only a tightness in his throat that made it hard to breathe. He left quietly, locking the door behind him. When Jesse arrived at the fire station, he was greeted by the familiar hum of conversation and the smell of coffee brewing. Warren, a stout man in his mid-50s with a reassuring presence, waved him over. "Another night of broken sleep?" the captain asked, studying Jesse's tired eyes. Jesse nodded. "Yeah, but I'm all right." Warren gave him a concerned look but didn't press further. He knew better than to push Jesse into talking about his past. The morning was routine, checking gear, running maintenance on trucks, exchanging jokes with fellow firefighters like Marco, a 30-year-old rookie who idolized Jesse's calm under pressure. Yet beneath the day-to-day tasks, Jesse's mind kept drifting back to the nightmares. He wondered if they would ever fade, or if some part of him needed them to stay vigilant, to remember why he did this job. Shortly after lunchtime, the crew was halfway through equipment drills when the station's alarm shrilled. Jesse's heart thudded as he pulled on his gear. An emergency call had come in about a car accident with potential fire risk on a major highway. The men and women of the department moved swiftly, well-trained instincts taking over. Jesse climbed into the engine truck, mind racing through possible scenarios. He'd done this so many times that the motions were second nature, but he could never banish the flicker of apprehension inside him, the lingering fear that once again he might be too late. And as they sped toward the incident, lights flashing, sirens wailing, Jesse gazed through the windshield at the gathering columns of smoke on the horizon. A shiver coursed through him, a premonition he couldn't name. Something about this call felt unsettlingly personal, as if fate were aligning the pieces of his life for one more test he wasn't sure he could pass. The shriek of sirens echoed across the concrete expanse of the highway. Jesse's pulse hammered in his ears as the fire engine rumbled to a halt behind a small crowd of onlookers. Black smoke billowed from a sedan that had spun out of control and hit the guardrail. Flames licked the air around the crumpled hood, sending waves of heat across the pavement. Marco hopped off the truck first and sprinted to assess the scene. Jesse followed, pulling on his fire-resistant gloves and scanning for immediate hazards. Cars slowed, forming a bottleneck, and anxious drivers watched from their windows. The entire area hummed with chaotic energy. "Possible entrapment!" Marco yelled over the roar of the flames. "The driver's still inside." Jesse's adrenaline spiked. He signaled to Sarah Mitchell, who had arrived with the ambulance, to be on standby. Warren barked instructions to the rest of the crew to set up a perimeter and get hoses ready. Jesse approached the sedan, noticing the passenger side was smashed beyond recognition. The driver's side door was bent inward, making it impossible to open from the outside. Heat radiated so fiercely that sweat instantly formed on Jesse's brow, even under his protective helmet. A quick glance through the shattered window revealed a lone occupant. It looked like a woman, unconscious or close to it, slumped against the steering wheel. Despite the pungent smell of burning plastic, Jesse forced himself to remain clear-headed. He tried the door handle, but the metal was twisted. Thick smoke spewed from beneath the hood. Knowing time was of the essence, Jesse stepped back, grabbed a Halligan tool, and slammed it into the window, shattering what remained of the glass. Flames licked closer, feeding on the gasoline that leaked beneath the wreck. Reaching in, Jesse struggled to release the driver's seatbelt. The buckle was jammed, so he sliced through it with a rescue knife. As he eased her head back, he saw that she wasn't fully unconscious. Her eyes fluttered, revealing a flash of terror and disorientation. "Stay calm," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm getting you out." She tried to speak, but only a faint croak emerged. Jesse maneuvered carefully, mindful of the debris and the sudden bursts of flames. When the seatbelt finally came free, he slid his arms beneath her shoulders, bracing her neck to prevent any further injury. A piece of twisted metal blocked his exit, and the heat grew intolerable. Outside, Warren and Marco doused the flames with water and foam, trying to buy Jesse more time. The woman let out a soft moan, and Jesse could see she was losing consciousness again. He shoved the metal debris aside with all his strength and freed enough space to pull her through the window. His protective gear offered some shield, but sparks flickered dangerously close. Warren helped them clear the final obstacle. Together, they eased the woman onto a stretcher that Sarah had set up. Her pulse was weak but detectable. Burn marks darkened one side of her jacket. She must have been struck by the searing heat after the collision. Sarah checked her vitals, and Jesse stood by, breath ragged. The crew put out the fire within minutes, preventing it from spreading to other vehicles. Police arrived to redirect traffic, and paramedics rushed the driver into the ambulance. Jesse found himself lingering, watching as the ambulance door slammed shut. He felt a sharp tug of concern, an odd kind of connection that was more personal than any standard rescue warranted. Back at the fire truck, Warren laid a hand on Jesse's shoulder. "Good job," he said, face grimy from smoke. "You got her out just in time." Jesse just nodded. His mind still swirled with the image of the woman's fearful eyes. He had saved countless people before, yet this time it felt different. There was a nagging sensation, as though this rescue would somehow matter more in his life than all the others. When the scene was finally under control, the crew piled back onto the truck. They returned to the station, greeted by applause from a few colleagues who had monitored the rescue via dispatch radio. Amid the camaraderie, Jesse remained unusually quiet. Sarah caught him staring into the distance and gently nudged him. "You all right?" she asked, voice low. "Yeah," he murmured, running a hand through his short hair. "Just something about the way she looked at me." Sarah offered a sympathetic smile. "Don't worry, you did your job, like always." Jesse appreciated the comfort, but felt an undercurrent of anxiety creeping in. That look in the woman's eyes, the momentary awareness between them, he couldn't shake it. He removed his gear in silence, his mind replaying the rescue over and over. He had no name, no context, just an insistent pull telling him that this was far from the last time he'd think about her. Early the next morning, Jesse stared into his mug of black coffee at the station's break room. The aroma was strong, but did nothing to lift the unease lodged in his chest. He'd barely slept the night before, unable to stop thinking about the woman he'd pulled from that flaming car. He wondered if she had any family, someone who would rush to the hospital and hold her hand. More than once, he considered driving to the hospital himself, if only to check on her condition. Warren entered with a newspaper tucked under his arm. He took one look at Jesse and shook his head knowingly. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" Jesse sighed. "I just keep hoping she's okay. She looked so terrified." Warren set the paper on the table. "You've handled hundreds of rescues. This one shouldn't be any different." But his tone held a gentle edge. He and Jesse both knew that sometimes a call resonated more deeply than others. As they talked, another firefighter passed by, calling out that the paramedics had left a message for Jesse. He excused himself and followed the corridors until he found Sarah writing up notes from the previous shift. She glanced up. "I heard you wanted some details," she said, reading the question in his eyes. "The victim's name is Helen Campbell. She's in serious but stable condition. They transferred her to Boston General last night." The moment Jesse heard the name, a faint chill moved through him. He couldn't pinpoint why it sounded vaguely familiar. Perhaps it was simply a coincidence. He offered a tight nod, grateful for the information. "Thank you," he replied, voice taut. Sarah studied him carefully. "Listen, Jesse, it's normal to feel attached after a rescue like that, especially when it was so close. But you need to take care of yourself too. You can't shoulder every outcome alone." He wanted to argue that he was fine, that he knew the difference between professional concern and personal entanglement. Yet the memory of Helen's frightened eyes refused to fade. Instead, he gave Sarah a quick smile and made his way back to the common area, where the other firefighters were busy with morning routines. A short while later, while cleaning the truck's hoses, Jesse's mind drifted to the day Todd died. It had been a residential fire well past midnight. Todd was trapped on the second floor when the building's structure collapsed. Jesse had tried to get to him, but the flames were too intense. By the time backup arrived, it was too late. That failure still carved out a space in Jesse's heart he hadn't been able to fill, no matter how many people he rescued. He paused, gripping the hose as if to steady himself. Every day as a firefighter was a reminder of Todd's final moments. Sometimes it felt like atonement, other times a torment he couldn't escape. His ex-wife, Linda Campbell, had been by his side then. In the aftermath of the tragedy, their marriage unraveled under grief, accusations, and Jesse's own barricade of silence. Linda's family had also been critical, implying that if Jesse had been more careful, perhaps Todd would have survived. He had never truly forgiven himself or them. Shaking his head to dispel the painful recollection, Jesse pushed himself to focus on the present. He finished cleaning and secured the equipment for the next emergency call. Normally, that would be enough to occupy his thoughts, but Helen Campbell's name kept resurfacing. He found himself considering the improbable connection. Campbell wasn't that uncommon of a last name, but it still rattled him. By lunchtime, he was restless. Warren, noticing, suggested they drive out to pick up supplies, anything to break Jesse's cycle of rumination. The short trip to a local hardware store allowed them to talk about sports, station repairs, and trivial matters. But even then, Jesse's mind wandered back to Helen. He imagined her lying in a hospital bed, alone and in pain. When they returned, Jesse prepared to start a routine maintenance check on the engines. Instead, he found his footsteps leading him to the quiet corner of the station where personal phone calls were allowed. He pulled out his cell phone, stared at it, and then glanced around to ensure no one else was nearby. He dialed Boston General's main line. After a few transfers, a nurse told him that Helen Campbell was still in the ICU, but showing signs of improvement. The nurse couldn't reveal much else due to patient privacy. Jesse thanked her and ended the call. He tucked the phone back into his pocket, a swirl of relief and worry pooling in his gut. Helen Campbell was alive. That should have been enough, he told himself. Yet there was a persistent tug urging him to see her, as if somehow, by visiting, he could ease the weight that pressed down on him, the same weight that had never truly lifted since Todd's death. Later that evening, Jesse found himself at home, staring blankly at the TV while the local news droned in the background. He had a bowl of microwaved pasta on his lap, untouched. His exhaustion from the day's training and calls should have knocked him out, but his mind would not let go of the thought that he should visit Helen. Images of the accident replayed behind his eyes, the roaring flames, the twisted metal, and those fleeting moments when Helen had looked at him, her life hanging by a thread. He leaned forward, setting the pasta aside. His phone sat on the coffee table, tempting him to make another call or check on any new updates about her condition. Just as he was about to gather the courage to call the hospital again, a text came through from Sarah. "Hope you're doing all right. Remember to breathe. Let me know if you need to talk." He appreciated her concern, but hesitated to respond. He wasn't entirely sure what he needed, only that an uneasy sense of responsibility pushed him toward Helen. He closed his eyes and recalled the final argument he'd had with Linda before their divorce. It was after Todd's funeral, and she had demanded he open up about the details of that night. Jesse had refused, partly because he had already tortured himself with the specifics, and partly because Linda's father, Charles Campbell, had made it painfully clear where he stood. Even Linda's sister, Helen, was never mentioned much after the separation, at least not in Jesse's presence. Somewhere in the fog of his memories, he remembered Linda saying that her younger sister was independent and always away, traveling for work or law school. Jesse had never met her during his marriage, as Helen had been living in another city. He tried to recall more, but his mind drew a blank, leaving him with the unsettling possibility that the woman he rescued might be someone connected to that painful chapter in his life. At the thought of that coincidence, his heart pounded harder. Campbell, he repeated in his head. It could be a strange twist of fate, or it could just be a random case of two people sharing a common surname. Yet the curiosity gnawed at him with each passing minute. Unable to shake the feeling, Jesse flipped off the TV, grabbed his jacket, and headed out the door. The crisp night air stung his face as he walked the few blocks to where he'd parked his truck. He climbed in, turned the key, and glanced at the clock. It was late, but visiting hours at Boston General's ICU extended until a certain hour for immediate family and special circumstances. He wasn't sure if a firefighter checking on a rescue victim qualified as special circumstances, but he was ready to try. Traffic was light as he navigated the city streets. When he arrived at the hospital, he hesitated in the parking lot. After a long moment, he stepped out, telling himself this was simply to ensure she was doing well. No other motive. Inside the main lobby, a fluorescent glow gave everything a sanitized, hushed quality. The overhead speaker announced different ward extensions and visiting hours. Jesse approached the front desk, explained that he was the firefighter who had brought in Helen Campbell, and asked if he could see her briefly. The desk clerk hesitated, but made a phone call to the ICU. After what felt like an eternity, the clerk nodded and handed him a temporary visitor badge. He wound through corridors lined with softly beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. At the end of a hallway, he found a glass door with the letters ICU printed in bold. He noticed a nurse stepping out of one of the rooms, so he approached her quietly. "I'm here to see Helen Campbell," he said, voice subdued. "I helped bring her in." The nurse, an older woman with a kind expression, studied him for a moment. "She's still recovering. She's awake on and off," the nurse said gently. "You can step inside, but please keep it brief." Jesse swallowed hard, stepping through the door. It felt like crossing an invisible threshold into a place he didn't belong. The bright overhead lights hummed, and the monitor by Helen's bed showed a steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She was lying there, bandages on her shoulder and a few bruises visible on her face. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was calm. He approached slowly, each footstep seeming too loud in the hushed space. A swirl of emotions raced through him. Relief she was alive, anxiety about intruding, and a flicker of something else he couldn't name. Standing beside her bed, he gently cleared his throat, unsure if she could hear him. I just wanted to see if you were okay," he whispered, though her eyes remained shut. He could see the slight motion of her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket, as if even in unconsciousness she sensed a presence. He felt an ache in his chest, an inexplicable need to protect her. Even though the day's adrenaline had subsided, some deeper drive within him refused to let go. Jesse stood there for several moments, feeling out of place in the sterile quiet. He was about to turn and leave when Helen stirred. Her eyes opened, clouded with pain and disorientation. She blinked, focusing first on the IV drip next to her before letting her gaze travel up to Jesse. He managed a small smile. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'm Jesse. I was the firefighter who pulled you from the car." Helen's brow furrowed in confusion. It took her a few seconds to respond. "I remember flames," she said, her voice raspy. "And then someone grabbed me. You." "Yeah." He tried to keep his tone gentle. "I just wanted to make sure you were doing okay." She offered a faint, grateful nod. "Thank you. I'm not sure how to express it, sir, but thank you for saving my life." "Don't worry about that," he replied, feeling a rush of warmth he hadn't anticipated. "It's what I do." "How are you feeling?" Helen swallowed hard, looking down at her bandaged shoulder. "Sore." my head spinning. Her eyes drifted across the room, as though searching for something familiar. My fiancé, Eric, was supposed to come by. Jessie noticed a fleeting sadness cross her features. Maybe he'll be here soon, he offered, though he couldn't help wondering why the fiancé wasn't already there. Helen exhaled shakily. It's probably work. He's always busy. Shifting slightly, she winced. Her gaze settled on Jessie's face. I keep thinking about the accident, but it's all jumbled in my head. I only remember being pinned in the car and feeling the heat. Then darkness, and your voice. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gratitude. You were lucky in a lot of ways. The fire didn't get a chance to spread too far before we arrived. Helen stared at him with an expression that suggested she was trying to place him in some larger context. Your name is Jesse Brown? He froze, pulse jolting. Yeah, he said, trying to mask his surprise. Have we met before? For a moment, Helen remained silent. A shadow of recognition passed over her eyes, but it was tinged with uncertainty. I'm not sure, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. My last name is Campbell, Helen Campbell. The name lingered in the air. Jessie felt like the walls were closing in. He drew in a sharp breath, remembering his ex-wife Linda, whose maiden name was also Campbell. His thoughts raced. It's a big city. Campbell is a common name. This could be a coincidence. But something deeper told him it might not be coincidence at all. Still, he forced a smile. Campbell, he repeated, making sure his voice stayed calm. That's nice. She caught the shift in his tone and narrowed her eyes a bit. Does that ring a bell? You look like you might know something. He shook his head, grappling for a neutral answer. I was married once, he said after a lengthy pause. My ex-wife's name was Linda Campbell. But you're probably not related, right? Helen's eyes grew wide, and the sudden tension in the room was palpable. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but closed it again as if the words were stuck in her throat. Finally, she found her voice. Linda is my sister. It felt as if the temperature in the room plummeted. Jesse's breath caught in his chest. He stared at Helen, unable to form a coherent response. Linda had never shared much about her family, or at least not when they were together. He had known that Linda came from a prominent household, had a father named Charles, and an older sister he never met. He couldn't recall the details, but he hadn't imagined a scenario in which he would rescue that sister from a burning car years later. Helen looked equally rattled, her eyes flicking over Jesse's features as though seeing him for the first time. I had no idea, she managed, voice shaking slightly. Linda never mentioned... Her words trailed off as the realization washed over her. You were the brother-in-law I never met. They stared at each other, the hospital's beeping monitors filling the silence. For Jesse, the moment was surreal. All the old wounds and the painful memories of losing Todd, of being judged by Linda's family, collided with the relief he felt about saving Helen. He wondered if she, too, had heard the stories, whatever Linda and her family had said about him in the years since the divorce. His voice caught in his throat. This is a lot, he said, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to barge in and shatter the tension. Look, I just wanted to check on you. I didn't mean to dredge up anything. Helen's expression softened, mixed with shock and gratitude. I appreciate you coming by, I do. She took a shaky breath. There's so much to say, but I'm not sure where to start. Jesse pressed his lips together, nodding slowly. He was equally at a loss. The last thing he had expected from this visit was a connection to his ex-wife, and that entire painful chapter of his life. The nurse gently knocked on the door, reminding them to keep things brief. Before turning to leave, Jesse cast Helen one last look, seeing confusion and a hint of hope flickering in her eyes. He felt it too, a jumbled combination of relief that she was alive, disbelief at her identity, and something else entirely. The sense that life had just placed them both on a path neither could have foreseen. Jesse left the hospital room feeling the air thicken around him. The nurse at the ICU desk shot him a sympathetic glance as he returned the visitor badge. He was too preoccupied to notice much else, replaying the conversation with Helen in his mind. She was Linda's sister. It was a fact he still couldn't wrap his head around. When he stepped out onto the street, the chilly night struck him with a bracing force. He stood by his truck, exhaling slowly. A cluster of thoughts crowded into his head. Linda's accusations after Todd's death, her father's disdain, and now Helen, someone he had saved without knowing she was part of the very family that had once condemned him. He rested his arms on the hood of his truck, trying to steady his breath. The next morning, he arrived at the fire station earlier than usual, hoping to find some routine tasks to keep his mind off the revelation. He started his shift by double-checking the water pumps, then reviewing the station's readiness for the day. Marco noticed his tense demeanor. "Hey, man, you okay?" Marco asked, tapping him lightly on the shoulder. "Yeah, just didn't get much sleep," Jesse replied, keeping his tone clipped. A short while later, Captain Warren McAllister walked into the garage area with a stack of paperwork. He eyed Jesse's stiff posture. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Warren remarked. "Everything all right after your hospital visit?" Jesse set down a coiled fire hose, his jaw tight. "She's stable, which is good. But turns out she's Linda's sister." Warren's eyebrows shot up. "Linda Campbell." He let out a low whistle. "That's one hell of a coincidence." "Feels more like a cosmic joke," Jesse muttered. "I had no idea. Now I'm caught off guard, and I'm not sure how to handle it." Warren sighed. "Sometimes you gotta face the past head on, whether you like it or not. The real question is, does Helen actually hold any grudges, or is she willing to see the truth about what happened?" Jesse couldn't answer that yet. He just knew that a knot of anxiety twisted in his gut whenever he imagined facing Linda's family again. He busied himself with the morning drill, but his focus kept drifting. By midday, he stepped away to the break room, where he found Sarah finishing a report at the small Formica table. She looked up, concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Jesse said, taking a seat. He explained the startling connection between Helen and Linda. Sarah blinked in surprise. "That's a lot to take in." She set down her pen and studied him. "How do you feel about it?" He shook his head, tension evident in his voice. "Confused. She seems nothing like Linda, but I'm afraid the rest of the Campbell family will soon crawl out of the woodwork. I remember how they treated me after Todd's death." Sarah hesitated. Could it be different this time? Helen might not share their perspective. Jesse shrugged. He recalled Helen's uncertain expression. She had looked more stunned than accusatory. "I guess I'll find out," he said quietly. Later that day, while Jesse was rechecking an engine's fluid levels, his phone vibrated. He pulled it from his pocket to see an unfamiliar number. On a hunch, he answered. "Hello?" A breathy pause. "Jesse, it's Helen. I hope it's okay that I'm calling." He wiped a streak of grease from his hand and walked a few steps away from the others. "Yeah, I'm glad you're all right. How are you feeling?" Helen's voice sounded cautious but earnest. "Better, thanks. The doctor says I'll be able to leave the hospital in a few days." "Listen, can we talk? I mean, really talk?" He hesitated. "Are you sure that's what you want?" She let out a quiet sigh. "I need to understand some things, especially about Linda. She and I aren't that close, but I know enough to sense there's more to the story than what was said back then." Jesse rubbed his forehead, the tension climbing. I'd like to clear the air if that's what you're asking. But you might hear things your family never told you, things I'm not sure you'll want to believe. Helen's tone held a note of resolve. I'm prepared for that. I just don't want to keep carrying around half-truths. I realize our meeting is complicated, but in a weird way. Maybe it's necessary. Jesse glanced toward Warren, who nodded encouragingly as though he could sense the nature of the call. Jesse steeled himself. All right. I'll come by tomorrow evening if that works, after my shift. Helen murmured her agreement, and they ended the call. Jesse slid the phone back into his pocket. He inhaled slowly, aware that he was about to step into a tangled web of old resentments and possibly new insights. Part of him wished he could keep his head down and avoid every painful reminder of the past. Another part, however, felt drawn to the chance for honesty, maybe even closure. He turned back to the engine, but his mind was already leaping ahead to what he might say when he met Helen again. The weight of the coming conversation pressed on him, but a sliver of hope flickered beneath the anxiety. Maybe, for the first time in years, he was about to let someone see the raw truth of what happened, and in doing so, finally find a measure of peace. Jesse arrived at the hospital just after 6 in the evening. He found the corridors less crowded than before, and as he made his way to Helen's room, he could hear the hushed cadence of nurses' voices. The overhead lighting cast a calm, subdued glow, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his own mind. Helen was propped up against several pillows, her left arm cradled in a sling, bruises still visible along her forearm. When she spotted Jesse by the doorway, a tentative smile crossed her face. The uncertainty of their connection hovered between them. He pulled a chair close to the bed, lowering himself into it. "You look better," he said gently. "How's the pain?" Helen lifted a hand to brush back a stray lock of hair. "Manageable. Though the doctors say it'll be a while before I'm fully healed. I have some burns on my shoulder, but they're not as bad as they could have been." The air crackled with unspoken questions. Helen broke the silence first. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be awkward." Jesse nodded. "Yeah, it is, but I figured we'd both just lay it out there, right?" She studied him, eyes flickering with curiosity. "Linda and I were never close. She's older than me by 2 years, but we grew up in very different ways. She went to law school here in Boston. I went to a different state for my education. We rarely crossed paths." Helen paused, searching Jesse's expression. "I do know about Todd's death. My parents, they said some harsh things about you." Jesse winced, memories flooding back. "I'm not surprised. They believed I should have done more, that I was reckless. But Todd was my brother. I did everything I could." He rubbed his palms, feeling the familiar guilt surface. Even Linda had her doubts. She never came out and said I killed him, but she implied it. Helen exhaled slowly. "I heard bits of the family story. My father, Charles, he can be very controlling. Once he forms an opinion, he rarely changes it." Jesse shifted in his seat. "I understand their grief. I was grieving too, but that got lost in the blame game. After Todd's funeral, Linda and I argued constantly. My attempts to explain fell on deaf ears." He looked away, recalling the final confrontation when Linda had demanded a divorce. Helen reached over, placing a cautious hand on Jesse's forearm. "I'm sorry you went through that. Even before the accident, my parents didn't think Linda's marriage to a firefighter was a good match for her. They're very status-minded." Jesse nodded grimly, recalling Charles Campbell's cold stare. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both absorbed in past hurts. Eventually, Helen cleared her throat. "I want to form my own opinion, Jesse. About you." "About what happened?" He swallowed against the knot in his throat, hearing the sincerity in her voice. "And how do you propose we do that?" Helen's gaze dropped to the hospital blanket. I'm not sure. I guess it starts with honest conversation. I wish I'd met you under different circumstances, not like this. She gestured to her injured body, then forced a small smile. But I'm grateful you saved me. The atmosphere was thick with tentative understanding. Jesse felt a weight lift slightly off his chest. He realized he might finally have the chance to let someone from that family see him for who he truly was, beyond the blame. A nurse entered to check Helen's vitals, interrupting their exchange. Jesse stepped aside politely. He noticed the nurse's badge, Riley. She had a warm, motherly presence. After finishing up, she glanced at Jesse with kindly curiosity. Visiting hours are almost over, but you can stay a bit more if Helen wants. Helen nodded. Thanks, Mrs. Riley. I'd like that. Once the nurse left, Helen's features tightened slightly. I'm expecting someone else tomorrow. My fiancé, Eric. He's been busy with work. He's a partner at a financial firm. My father approves, of course. Jesse raised an eyebrow. Right. He recalled how Linda's parents had always wanted her to marry someone suitable. Helen grimaced, reading his thoughts. I love Eric, or at least I thought I did. But in the last year, we've grown distant. Sometimes it feels more like a merger than a relationship. Jesse wasn't sure how to respond. He felt a pang of sympathy. The woman lying here clearly had her own battles, distinct from Linda's. That's something only you can figure out, he said softly. Just make sure you don't let anyone else live your life for you. She nodded, looking thoughtful. I won't, and that's why I'm glad we're talking, even if it feels strange. They spent the next half hour sharing pieces of their histories. Helen's early years studying law in Chicago, Jesse's journey from volunteer firefighting in his hometown to a professional role in Boston. With each exchange, the tension eased. He glimpsed a woman who wasn't defined by the Campbell family's rigid expectations, and she saw a man still haunted by grief but determined to move forward. As the overhead speaker chimed to announce the end of visiting hours, Jesse knew he had to leave. He didn't want to overstay his welcome. Rising, he offered Helen a gentle nod. Neither of them had any illusions that the past was settled, but a tentative bridge had been formed, one that might lead them to truths neither had fully understood before. The next time Jesse visited the hospital, the atmosphere in Helen's room had changed. He could hear voices raised in an argument from outside the door. The first was Helen's, calm but insistent. The second belonged to a man with a controlled yet irritated tone. Jesse hesitated, one hand hovering near the door handle. Eric, I told you already I need some space to recover, Helen was saying. This isn't about you. It's about us, the man retorted, voice clipped. You nearly died, and you don't think I should be here as much as possible. Have you considered how this looks? You're alone with some firefighter. That's enough, Helen cut in sharply. He saved my life. And we've been talking, that's all. The tension in the room spiked. Jesse exhaled, steeling himself, then knocked softly. After a second, he opened the door, stepping inside to see Helen sitting up in bed, arms crossed. A tall, impeccably dressed man stood by the window, jaw clenched. His designer suit looked out of place against the hospital's sparse backdrop. Helen offered Jesse a faint smile. Hey, good timing. Eric Whitmore turned, scanning Jesse from head to toe with an air of barely veiled contempt. His presence radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. So this is the firefighter, he said, eyebrows raised. Eric Whitmore. I'm Helen's fiancé. Jesse nodded politely, feeling the hostility roll off Eric in waves. Jesse Brown, it's nice to finally meet you. Eric made no move to shake hands. Instead, he turned back to Helen. We were just discussing her safety, he said pointedly. She doesn't think a private nurse or a safer facility is necessary. I disagree. Helen's lips pressed into a firm line. You disagree with me a lot these days, she muttered. Then she looked at Jessie. Can we talk alone? A flicker of anger flashed across Eric's face. You want me to leave? Please, Eric, I'll call you later, Helen replied, her tone holding a quiet finality. With a tight nod, Eric gathered his suit jacket from the chair. Before leaving, he paused near Jessie, lowering his voice. I don't know what your game is, Brown, but don't get too comfortable. Helen and I are engaged, and that's not going to change. Jessie swallowed back an instinctive retort. He simply returned Eric's glare evenly. Once the door closed, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He seems protective. Helen sighed. Overbearing might be a better word. My father adores him. He's exactly the kind of man Charles Campbell wants for me. Wealthy, respected, and politically well-connected. Jessie moved closer, noticing Helen's tightened posture. That doesn't sound like your first choice. She didn't reply immediately, seeming to weigh her words. When Eric and I first got together, things were different. We had fun. We respected each other's goals. But as time passed, he became more focused on how our marriage would elevate his status. My father encouraged it. I guess I just fell into line. Jessie nodded, recalling how Linda had once tried to conform to her parents' expectations. Does Linda know you're engaged? Helen smirked. Linda offered congratulations when we announced it at a family gathering, but we haven't really spoken about it. She's got her own career and life. We've never been close enough to share much. Jessie shifted uncomfortably. I can relate in a way. I never felt accepted by your parents. Helen studied him. You married Linda despite that. He shrugged. She made me believe it wouldn't matter. Then Todd died, and everything changed. They both fell silent, reflecting on how external pressures could warp relationships. Jessie wondered if Helen was trapped in the same cycle, obligated to please her father, living a life that didn't suit her. Eventually, Helen cleared her throat. About Linda. She hesitated. Have you spoken to her at all since we found out who we are to each other? Jessie shook his head. I've avoided contact with her for a long time. There was nothing left to say after the divorce. She blamed me for Todd's death. Her family never wanted me around. Helen exhaled. I see. Well, Linda came by this morning, but she left quickly. She didn't seem thrilled to learn that you and I have been talking. She said she needed to discuss some things with me later. A knot of unease formed in Jessie's stomach. I can't imagine she's happy about this. Helen managed a small smile. To be honest, I don't think she's furious at me. It's more like she's warning me. She said something about how you can't let go of the past, but I'm starting to suspect she's the one who can't let go. Jessie let that settle for a moment. He glanced at the IV drip attached to Helen's arm. It reminded him of how vulnerable she was right now, injured, with conflicting voices all around her. Look, he began quietly, I know this is your personal life, but if you ever need help, let me know. I don't want you feeling cornered by anyone, not Eric, not your family, no one. Helen gazed at him, her expression softening. You barely know me, Jessie. Why would you care so much? He shrugged, struggling to articulate the tangle of emotion in his chest. Because I saved you once, he said finally, his eyes meeting hers. And maybe I just don't want to see you hurt, in any sense of the word. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that their lives had become unexpectedly intertwined. The beep of a hallway monitor broke the hush. Outside, a nurse wheeled in a supply cart, reminding them they weren't in a world of their own, but a hospital bustling with staff and patients. Helen reached for a cup of water on the bedside table. Thanks, she said softly, taking a slow sip. I might just accept that offer, depending on how things go." Jesse nodded, realizing this was more than just another rescue. Whatever path lay ahead, it was bound to be fraught with conflict, family expectations, an unsettled ex-wife, and a powerful fiancé who saw Jesse as a threat. Yet despite it all, he couldn't deny the sense that he was exactly where he needed to be at this moment, for Helen and perhaps for himself. In the following days, Helen's condition improved enough that her doctors considered discharging her soon. She walked slowly with a physical therapist, regaining strength, and the bruises on her face began to fade. During this time, Jesse found himself drawn to the hospital more often than he had anticipated. Not every visit involved conversation. Sometimes he just stood by her room's doorway, exchanging a nod or a faint smile when she was too tired to talk. One afternoon, as he made his way to Helen's room, a voice called out from behind, "Jesse Brown!" He turned to see a man in a plain grey suit, mid-40s, with a police badge clipped to his belt. "Yeah, John Matthews, Boston PD detective," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm a friend of Helen's. She asked me to look into the cause of her accident." Jesse shook his hand cautiously. "Any new information?" Matthews pursed his lips. "Preliminary evidence suggests a mechanical failure, possibly the steering, but we can't rule out other factors yet. Helen mentioned you saved her. She's lucky you got there so fast." Jesse nodded. "That's the job. If you find anything else, let me know. She deserves answers." The detective agreed and walked off, leaving Jesse with the sense that Helen had allies beyond just her family, people who genuinely cared about her well-being. It was a reassuring thought, considering the tension with Eric and Linda. When Jesse arrived at Helen's room, he found her sitting in a chair by the window, absent-mindedly flipping through an old magazine. She looked up. "Hey," she greeted with a tentative warmth. "John talked to you?" "He did," Jesse replied, taking a seat nearby. "You asked him to investigate?" Helen nodded. "Something felt off about my car that day. My brakes were screeching before the crash. It might be nothing, but I'd rather be sure." They chatted briefly about the accident, then fell into a more personal discussion. Jesse spoke about how he'd become a firefighter, the drive he felt after Todd's death to prevent as many tragedies as possible. In turn, Helen described her early desire to become a lawyer, fueled by a passion for justice that sometimes put her at odds with her own family's more pragmatic approach to life. "Funny," Jesse remarked. "Linda always said I was the one who liked to stand up for what was right, no matter how stubborn it seemed. Maybe that's something you and I share, ironically." Helen chuckled. "That's ironic indeed. Maybe that's why we haven't clashed yet." Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse who came to check Helen's vitals. Jesse used the moment to glance around the room. He noticed a few floral arrangements on a side table, presumably from friends or colleagues. One extravagant bouquet had a card with Eric's name written in neat, bold letters. When the nurse left, Helen followed his gaze. "Eric's been sending gifts and calling, but we keep missing each other," she said, her brow furrowed. "I suppose I should talk to him in person. We need to sort things out." Jesse thought about the argument he'd overheard. "It's your life," he murmured. "You'll make the right call." She studied him, eyes searching. "It means something that you believe I can make the right decisions for myself." He shrugged. "Everyone else in your life seems to have their own agenda for you. Your dad, Eric, even Linda. Maybe you just need someone who doesn't expect anything except for you to be you." The corner of Helen's mouth curved into a faint smile. "I appreciate that." "Really?" They were interrupted by footsteps echoing in the corridor. Linda Campbell appeared at the doorway, face taut with tension. She had the same sharp features as Helen, though her eyes carried a flicker of resentment when she noticed Jesse. Helen invited Linda inside with a polite nod. Jesse stood, intending to leave and give them space, but Helen motioned for him to stay. Linda took a seat on the edge of Helen's bed, crossing her arms. "You seem better," Linda observed, her tone guarded. "I am," Helen responded. "Thank you for visiting." A strained pause settled in. Linda's gaze flicked to Jesse, then back to Helen. "I'm guessing Jesse told you about the past," Linda said tersely. Helen nodded, bracing herself. "He told me about Todd, about the fire, about how you and Dad reacted." Linda pressed her lips together. "Yes. Well, we all had a hard time. Maybe we said things in anger, but Todd was family. We expected Jesse to, I don't know, we expected miracles, I guess." Jesse felt a surge of indignation, but kept quiet. Helen's expression grew more serious. "I understand grief does strange things to people, but I needed to know the full story." Linda looked at Jesse, something like regret mingling with defensiveness in her eyes. "I see you're not letting this go." Jesse cleared his throat, trying to speak calmly. "Helen deserves the truth, not a version shaped by blame." Another silence descended, heavy with unsaid apologies. Helen glanced between them, seeming to sense the weight of their history. Finally, Linda rose, shaking off her hesitation. "Helen, you can call me if you need anything. My schedule is packed, but I'm just a phone call away." She shot Jesse a final, unreadable look before stepping out into the hallway. Once Linda was gone, Helen released a breath she'd been holding. That was less explosive than I feared, but still awkward. Jesse nodded, his heartbeat slowing. "She's still angry at me, but it felt different. Maybe she's starting to question her own certainty." Helen tossed the magazine aside. "Bridges and barriers, right?" she said softly. "We're building a few bridges here, I think, but there are still plenty of barriers left to break," Jesse agreed, sensing that each interaction, whether with Linda or the rest of the Campbell family, would either reinforce the old walls or open new pathways toward understanding. There was no quick resolution in sight, but for the first time, he felt that some measure of reconciliation might be possible, however tenuous it seemed in the moment. Sarah Mitchell usually kept her distance from personal drama at the station, but when she found Jesse hunched over a coffee in the break room, she pulled up a chair beside him. The day's routine calls had slowed, leaving them a rare pocket of quiet. "You're thinking pretty hard," she remarked, taking a sip from her own mug. "Want to talk?" Jesse sighed. He explained his ongoing visits with Helen, the tension with Eric, and the fraught encounter with Linda. Through it all, Sarah listened intently, occasionally nodding in sympathy. "So Helen is your ex-wife's sister," Sarah summarized, eyes widening. "That's unusual." "Tell me about it," Jesse said, stirring his coffee absently. "But she's different from Linda, more open-minded." Sarah gave him a gentle nudge. "And is that starting to make you feel something beyond just concern for her well-being?" Heat rose in Jesse's cheeks. He looked away. "I don't know. She's engaged, for one thing, and I'm not looking to complicate my life, but she's easy to talk to, and it feels like we're both helping each other confront old wounds." Sarah set her mug down. "Then keep talking. If it turns into something, you'll figure it out. If it just helps you both heal, that's still worth it." That evening, Jesse dropped by the hospital to check on Helen and found an unexpected visitor in her room, John Matthews, the detective. He was flipping through a stack of papers while Helen listened intently. Jesse hovered by the doorway. "Afternoon," Jesse greeted, stepping in. "Everything all right?" Helen gave him a small smile. "John's updating me on the car investigation." Matthews looked up. "We found a manufacturing defect in the steering column. It's likely the main reason for the crash. I just wanted to let Helen know we're pressing the manufacturer to accept liability." Helen's face tensed. At least that explains the sudden loss of control. But thank you. I appreciate you digging deeper. Matthews nodded. I also have an old friend at the fire department who told me more about how you were rescued. Seems you were lucky Jesse here was quick on the scene. He turned to Jesse, expression warm. Good job, man. Jesse shrugged, a bit uncomfortable with the praise. Just doing what we're trained to do. Matthews organized his papers, then patted Helen's shoulder lightly. I'll be in touch. Try not to worry about the legal aspects. Focus on getting stronger. As the detective left, Helen leaned back against her pillows, looking relieved. At least that question's answered. Jesse pulled a chair closer. That's good news, right? Helen nodded, fiddling with the hem of her blanket. Yes, in a way, but it doesn't change the fact that my life feels shaken up. My engagement, my family issues, it's all in flux. And then there's you. He blinked at the note of uncertainty in her voice. Me? She paused, choosing her words carefully. The fact that you're the one who saved me, someone I was probably supposed to dislike because of old family drama, has changed things. I'm trying to figure out what it means for me, for Eric, for Linda. Jesse's stomach knotted. I can't answer that for you. Helen's eyes flicked to him. No, but you can be honest about how you feel. A subtle tension charged the air. Jesse rubbed the back of his neck, recalling Sarah's suggestion that he face his emotions head-on. Okay, he said, voice low. I care about you, and I want you to be safe. We've talked more than I ever did with Linda at the end. But I'm also aware that you have a fiancé and a life that doesn't necessarily include me. Helen exhaled slowly. He and I need to talk. A real conversation, not just the surface-level pleasantries or arguments. After that, maybe I'll know where we stand. Jesse nodded. For what it's worth, I'm not pressuring you to do anything, but if you need someone to talk to, someone who's not in your family's pocket, I'm here. The gratitude in her eyes was evident. Thank you. Before the conversation could delve deeper, they heard a soft knock. A familiar face peeked around the door. Captain Warren. Jesse shot upright, surprised. Warren stepped in, glancing around the hospital room with a fatherly air. Didn't mean to interrupt, he said, but I figured I'd drop by to see how our recent rescue is doing. Helen smiled politely. Thank you for coming. I owe all of you my life. Warren chuckled. We all do our part, but Jesse's the one who took the lead. Then his tone turned more serious. I also wanted to let Jesse know the department put in for a commendation on the rescue. Might be some local media interest. Jesse's face flushed. I don't need that. Warren patted Jesse's shoulder. You may not want the attention, but it's well deserved. We'll talk about it more at the station. Anyway, sorry to barge in. Warren didn't stay long, leaving almost as soon as he arrived, but the warmth of his presence lingered. Helen looked at Jesse with renewed appreciation, realizing that beyond their personal stories, he was respected in his professional circle as well. I don't know why, but it doesn't surprise me, she commented. You're not the type to brag, but everyone else seems to speak highly of you. Jesse shrugged off the praise. I'm just trying to do some good in this world. Helen met his gaze, and for a moment neither spoke. Some silent understanding passed between them, a sense that, in their own ways, they were forging an alliance rooted in honesty and empathy. It was unexpected, but it felt genuine. And for Jesse, that was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A week later, Helen was discharged from the hospital. Jesse offered to pick her up, but Eric insisted on handling it. So Jesse found himself standing outside Boston General's entrance, waiting on the sidewalk as Helen and Eric emerged through the sliding glass doors. Helen leaned on a cane for extra support, her shoulder still bandaged underneath her coat. Eric guided her with one hand, glancing around until he noticed Jessie. A faint scowl pinched Eric's features. "I've got her brown," he said flatly, helping Helen into the back seat of his sleek black SUV. Helen turned to Jessie, giving a quick smile. "I'll call you later, thanks for coming." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, as if reassuring him that she wanted him there. Jessie stepped back onto the curb, watching them drive off with a mix of concern and resignation. He could sense Eric's simmering jealousy. He wasn't sure how far Eric would go to keep Helen close, but he doubted it would be pleasant. That evening, Jesse tried to distract himself by cleaning his apartment. He put on some music, tossed out old takeout menus, and straightened a bookshelf of fire department manuals and old photo albums. Yet he found himself constantly checking his phone, hoping Helen would text or call. When it finally rang, he grabbed it on the first chime. "Hey!" Helen's voice came through softly. "I'm home." "You okay? How's Eric?" Jessie asked, bracing for her answer. She sighed, the sound muffled as though she were in another room. "He's trying to help, but we ended up arguing again. He keeps talking about how I should keep my distance from you, implying I don't need a hero complex interfering in our lives." Jesse rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling anger flare. "That's not surprising, but it's your choice who you see. You know that, right?" Helen paused. "I do. But it's tough when I'm in his house. Well, technically our house. We moved in together before the accident." Jesse swallowed hard. "If you ever need to get away for a while, you could come by my place. Strictly platonically," he added, feeling heat rise to his cheeks. "I have a couch if you just need space." There was a moment of silence on the line. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll keep that in mind." Over the next few days, Helen kept Jesse updated by phone. Meanwhile, Linda scheduled a meeting with Helen to discuss family matters, which made Jesse uneasy. He knew the Campbell family well enough to suspect they'd try to pressure Helen into following a certain path. Likely, the path that involved marrying Eric and steering clear of Jesse. One afternoon, as Jesse finished a shift at the station, his phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "Dad wants to see me, Linda, and Eric at the family estate. He insists. Wish me luck." A bad feeling churned in Jesse's gut. Charles Campbell never did anything casually. He recalled that imposing mansion with its high ceilings and polished floors, the place where Charles had made him feel so small. He typed a quick reply, "Be careful. Call if you need me," and tried to focus on cleaning the fire engine's compartments. Later that evening, Jesse was at home when his phone rang. He answered to hear Helen's voice, laced with tension. "Can you meet me somewhere?" He felt a jolt of concern. "What happened?" She let out a shaky breath. "It's complicated. My father is pushing for me to go ahead with the wedding, and Eric's backing him up. Linda's playing mediator, but it's basically 3 against 1. I need to clear my head. Can we talk?" Jesse grabbed his jacket. "Sure, where are you?" They agreed to meet at a small cafe near the harbor. Jesse arrived first, sipping hot tea while glancing at the door. When Helen walked in, she looked drained, her posture tense. He stood quickly to help her with the door, noticing she still limped slightly. She leaned the cane against the table and sank into a chair. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She removed her coat, revealing a bruise on her wrist. Jesse's eyes narrowed, and he immediately asked, "Helen, what happened to your wrist?" She glanced down as if noticing the mark for the first time. "It's nothing. Eric grabbed my arm earlier when I tried to leave. He got frustrated." Jesse felt a surge of anger. "He had no right to do that." Her voice wavered. "I know, but it wasn't intentional. He's just under pressure from my father to keep me in line." "They both keep saying I'm confused. That I'm throwing away a good life because of some firefighter who saved me. She looked at Jesse with pained eyes. I'm sorry. He shook his head. You have nothing to apologize for. They spoke in hushed tones, the cafe nearly empty except for a barista cleaning up behind the counter. Helen recounted the confrontation at the Campbell estate. Her father's insistence on finalizing wedding plans, Eric's growing impatience, Linda's half-hearted attempt to calm everyone. Finally, Helen sighed. They want me to stop talking to you. They say it's stirring up too many old issues. Jesse reached for her hand, a gentle, reassuring touch. I can stay away if that's what you want. But only if it's truly your choice. She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with tears she was fighting to hold back. That's just it. It's not what I want, but I'm not sure how to break free from their expectations. Eric's family is close to mine, and everything is so tangled, but I can't marry him just to make everyone else happy. Jesse leaned forward. Helen, your life is yours to live. If you don't want this wedding, you need to say so. She nodded, jaw clenched. I will, She paused, voice trembling. I'm scared of what they'll do if I defy them. My father can be vindictive. Eric has his pride. And Linda, she's no ally in this. At that moment, it hit Jesse how high the stakes were. The Campbell family possessed not just social power, but also significant influence that could impact Helen's career and her sense of safety. Despite his protective instincts flaring, he knew Helen had to make her stand on her own terms. He gently squeezed her hand. I'm here for whatever you need. Helen's eyes glistened as she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. I'm not sure how this will all play out, but I appreciate that you're by my side. In the dim light of the cafe, as the barista turned off the neon sign, it felt like a turning point. Jesse sensed that whatever came next, arguments with Eric, showdowns with Charles, or strained talks with Linda, would test both Helen's resolve and his own willingness to fight for what felt right. The first confrontation had happened, but it was clear this was only the beginning of a larger battle for Helen's independence and Jesse's chance at a peaceful heart. Over the next few days, Helen struggled under the weight of conflicting loyalties. She was recovering at the opulent house she shared with Eric in one of Boston's upscale neighborhoods, her every move monitored by a rotating staff of housekeepers and private nurses her fiancé had insisted on. The stately home boasted a marble foyer, tall windows overlooking a manicured garden, and rooms filled with carefully curated furniture that felt more like museum pieces than possessions meant for everyday life. Early one morning, Helen ventured outside for a short walk, leaning on her cane for support. The crisp autumn air stung her cheeks as she circled the garden. Despite the lush roses and trimmed hedges, she felt stifled, as though every detail of this place had been chosen by someone else for someone else. She paused near a stone bench, recalling how Eric's generosity had once impressed her, how it had seemed like a grand gesture of love. Now it felt more like a gilded cage. Not long after, she got a text from Jesse asking if she was feeling better. She replied with a brief reassurance, secretly grateful for his concern. They hadn't seen each other in person since their conversation at the cafe. She found herself missing the honesty of their talks. With him, she could acknowledge that her life was in turmoil without fear of being judged. Later that afternoon, she sat in the living room, an elegantly decorated space where she'd once hosted events with Eric to showcase their perfect partnership. Now it felt hollow. Eric was off at his firm, leaving her to recover alone. She was about to doze when Linda showed up unexpectedly. Dressed in a tailored suit, Linda walked in with the self-assurance of someone used to winning arguments in court. Helen tensed. "Did Eric call you?" Linda shook her head, setting her briefcase on a chair. "No, I came because Dad wants an update. He's concerned about the wedding plans, or lack thereof. He asked me to talk to you." Helen braced herself. There's not much to say. I'm still healing, physically and otherwise. Linda took a seat across from her, crossing one leg over the other. Helen, you're free to make your own decisions, but Dad expects a certain standard. This wedding is more than just a personal affair. It's practically a merger between two influential families. Postponing it indefinitely is going to raise questions. A flicker of frustration crossed Helen's face. What about what I want? What about the fact that Eric seems more interested in pleasing Dad than in supporting me? Linda hesitated. Eric is under pressure too. Father's old-fashioned, but his support matters. You know how he can be. He's offered to handle some of your medical bills and any future legal actions if you just cooperate. Helen exhaled slowly. It was typical of Charles Campbell to dangle financial incentives in exchange for compliance. She remembered how her father had always prized reputation and business connections over individual happiness. I can't marry someone just to keep Dad's reputation intact, she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Linda leaned forward. Then what is your plan, Helen? To sit in this house, texting that firefighter who's got no stake in our family? You think Dad will just accept that? The mention of Jesse made Helen clench her hands in her lap. Jesse saved my life. He's also been the only person who actually listens to me without an agenda. Linda's gaze hardened. He has his own baggage, Helen. You may not know the full story. He couldn't save his own brother. Did he tell you that? Did he tell you how our family felt about it? Yes, he did, Helen snapped, her voice reverberating around the lavish room. And maybe, if you'd given him a chance, you'd realize he's been drowning in guilt for years. While you and Dad pointed fingers, Linda's expression flickered, part guilt, part defiance. We were grieving too. Emotions were high. Helen realized she was gripping the arm of the sofa so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She forced herself to calm down. Look, I'm not saying I'm in love with Jesse, but I am saying I won't shun him just because Dad and Eric disapprove. I owe him at least my respect and my gratitude. A tense silence fell between them. Eventually, Linda sighed and stood, gathering her briefcase. You're my sister, Helen, and I do care about you. But be careful. If you push Dad too far, he'll cut you off in more ways than one. This family can be unforgiving. Helen watched Linda walk out, a knot tightening in her chest. She thought about the choices laid out before her: marry Eric to maintain the family's favor, or break away and risk their wrath. And somewhere in that tangled decision-making process stood Jesse, whose mere presence reminded her that she had the right to seek truth and a deeper sense of loyalty to herself. As the front door closed behind Linda, Helen felt the chill of the empty house settle on her shoulders. She reached for her phone, her heart pounding with conflicted emotions. The rift between her and her family had grown, and it was clear that each step she took now would be a test of how far her loyalty could stretch and whether she had the courage to prioritize her own life over everyone else's demands. Jesse was on shift at the fire station when he got a call from Warren. The captain's gruff voice crackled through the station's PA system, directing Jesse to come to his office. Curious, he hurried down the corridor, passing rows of red lockers and gleaming fire gear neatly arranged for the next emergency. Inside Warren's cramped office, the blinds were half drawn, letting in strips of daylight. Warren motioned for Jesse to sit. Got word from a friend at City Hall, he began, leaning back in his squeaky chair. Charles Campbell's been asking some pointed questions about you, your record, your performance. Any reason he'd be digging? Jesse felt a flash of heat behind his eyes. Charles is Helen's father, he said carefully. We've never gotten along. He blames me for a family tragedy. Warren scratched his chin. So he's pressing around, maybe looking for dirt to tarnish your reputation. Sounds like him, Jesse admitted. The captain's face hardened in sympathy. "Look, you've got a clean record here, but Campbell's a powerful man. Keep your head down, do your job. If anything fishy comes up, let me know." Jesse nodded, thanking him for the warning. As he walked out, a heaviness settled over him. He'd nearly forgotten how ruthless Charles could be in protecting his family's image. Jesse suspected Charles had learned of Jesse's renewed contact with Helen and saw it as a threat. After finishing paperwork, Jesse ran into Sarah in the station's communal kitchen. She was pouring coffee into a travel mug, eyes bright with concern. "Heard you got called in by Warren," she said. "Everything all right?" Jesse sighed. "Charles Campbell is poking around, probably trying to find a way to undermine me." Sarah frowned. "That's harassment. If he crosses a line, you can file a complaint." He nodded, though he knew it wasn't that simple. Charles had the resources to make subtle attacks that wouldn't easily meet the threshold of a formal complaint. And the last thing Jesse wanted was a public scandal that might drag Helen's name into it further. Later that day, after his shift ended, Jesse headed to a modest diner near the station, Kelly's, a spot famous for homemade pies and thick milkshakes. He slid into a booth and, after a moment's hesitation, texted Helen, "Heard your dad's been asking about me. You okay?" He expected a delayed response, but his phone buzzed almost immediately. "Yes, I'm fine. Sorry about Dad. He's overstepping." Jesse relaxed slightly. At least she wasn't avoiding him. He ordered a slice of apple pie and was halfway through when the door swung open, and to his surprise, Linda walked in. She spotted him right away and approached. In her smart business suit, she looked every bit the accomplished attorney. Jesse braced himself for a confrontation, but she slid onto the seat opposite him without asking, her posture tense but not hostile. "I figured I'd find you here," Linda said evenly. "You used to come here all the time after your shifts." Jesse set down his fork, heart pounding. "So, what can I do for you?" She exhaled sharply. "Helen's upset. She's talking about canceling her wedding. Dad is furious. She won't listen to me, and she sure won't listen to him." "I see," Jesse said slowly, "but why come to me?" Linda's gaze flicked to the table. "Because she trusts you. Despite everything, she sees you as an honest person who actually cares about her, not the family's agenda." Jesse felt a mix of relief and discomfort. "So you want me to convince her to marry Eric?" "No," Linda said, shaking her head. "It's her decision, but you and I both know Dad won't handle defiance kindly. I'm worried that if she goes through with this, he'll cut her off completely. Her work, her finances, everything could be jeopardized. I don't want her hurt." Jesse studied Linda's face. The anger that once burned between them had cooled over time, replaced by something closer to regret. "If Helen's determined, no one can force her to do otherwise. I won't lie to her, Linda, just to keep your dad happy." "I'm not asking you to lie," Linda countered, voice taut. "I'm asking you to think about the consequences of encouraging her to break away without a plan. She's vulnerable right now. She just recovered from a near-fatal accident. She might not be thinking clearly." Jesse suppressed the urge to snap back that Helen was the most lucid person in that family. Still, Linda had a point about the fallout. "So, what do you suggest?" he asked cautiously. Linda hesitated, tapping her manicured nails on the table. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe help her see the bigger picture before she tears herself away from everyone. She deserves a chance to fix things if that's still possible." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the diner filling the space between them. Outside, dusk had crept in, painting the windows with the glow of streetlights. Jesse looked at Linda, remembering how they had once shared a life together before everything burned down, both literally and metaphorically. "Look," he said at last, "I'll be there for Helen, no matter what she decides." But Charles can't expect me to vanish just because he hates me. Linda nodded, resigned. I never expected you to vanish. I guess I just hoped we could avoid another tragedy in this family. She rose from the booth, gave him one final look, somewhere between pleading and resignation, and headed out the door. Jesse stared at the slice of pie that suddenly didn't look appetizing. Everything felt tangled, the old scars from Todd's death, the new conflict with Charles, Linda's uneasy attempts at peace, and Helen's uncertain future. He checked his phone again. Helen hadn't sent another message, but he typed one more. I'm here if you need me. We'll figure it out together. Then he sat back, thinking about how the echoes of the past still reverberated through each of their lives, shaping every step they took in the present. A cold wind rattled the window panes of Jesse's apartment as he paced the living room, waiting for Helen's arrival. She had texted that she needed to speak to him privately, away from Eric and the prying eyes of her family. Jesse quickly tidied up, stashing away a few stray fire department manuals and clearing off the small wooden coffee table. When Helen knocked, he opened the door to find her clutching her coat around her shoulders. Her eyes looked tired, and her cheeks were flushed from the wind. He gently guided her inside, helping her settle on the couch. A faint aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the apartment. Jesse had brewed a pot in anticipation of her visit. Thanks, Helen murmured, exhaling as she sank into the cushions. Feels like I can finally breathe. Jesse offered her a steaming mug. Long day? She gave a short laugh. Every day feels long lately. Eric and I argued this morning. He insisted we pick a new wedding date soon, or he'd consider the engagement off. It was a threat more than anything else. Jesse leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. And how do you feel about that? A mix of frustration and sadness flickered across her face. In some ways, it might be a relief if he ended it, but I still hate the idea of a huge, messy fallout. My father will have a field day with it. They sipped coffee in silence for a moment. Outside, the streetlights cast a soft glow through the windows. Finally, Helen set her mug down, looking at Jesse intently. I need to know where you stand, Jesse. Our conversations have helped me a lot, but I realize I might be leaning on you more than I should. Her voice wavered, betraying vulnerability. I'm not sure I can navigate this alone, but I also don't want to drag you into my battles if you don't want to be there. Jesse felt his chest tighten with empathy. I'm not going to pretend this is easy, he said slowly. There's a lot of history with your family, but I'm not walking away, Helen. You matter to me. A faint smile touched her lips. That means more than you know. As they talked, the tension in the room softened. Helen confided that she'd begun to question everything. Her career goals, the kind of law she practiced, even the path that led her into Eric's world. She confessed she'd once dreamed of helping people in more direct ways, taking on pro bono cases for disadvantaged clients. But her father had steered her toward corporate law, praising its prestige. Eric had encouraged that path too, and she'd followed along, never pausing to ask herself if it fulfilled her. And now, Jesse asked, genuinely curious. She breathed in deeply. Now I'm wondering if I can reorient my life, do something that aligns with my conscience. Maybe that means stepping away from the corporate firm. Maybe it means stepping away from Eric. I'm still figuring it out. Jesse reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I respect that. Whatever you decide, it should be on your terms. Helen looked at him, eyes shining with gratitude. And something else. Before either could speak, Jesse's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. It was a call from the fire station's dispatch. Grimacing, he answered, and Helen could hear the urgency in the voice on the other end. Got it. Jesse said, ending the call. "There's a fire downtown. They need all available hands." "I'm sorry, I have to go." Helen nodded quickly. "I understand this is your duty." He stood, grabbing his coat. But before heading to the door, he paused, turning back to her. "Stay here if you want. Make yourself comfortable. There's food in the fridge. Otherwise, lock up when you go, but keep me posted." Helen rose, meeting his eyes. "Be careful." In that moment, Jesse felt a swell of emotion, concern for the emergency, an odd sense of relief that Helen was here, and a surge of protective instinct. "I will," he promised, then rushed out. The blaze was intense, an abandoned warehouse near the harbor, flames licking the night sky. By the time Jesse arrived, the fire had spread to adjacent structures. Heat pressed down like a physical force, and thick smoke billowed out, forcing the firefighters to work methodically to contain it. Jesse and his crew attacked the flames with powerful streams of water, inching closer to the inferno. Every movement was precise, every breath filtered through an oxygen mask. Hours later, exhausted and covered in soot, Jesse peeled off his gear and checked his phone. A single text from Helen awaited him. "I'm heading home, but thank you for letting me stay. I hope you're safe. Please call me." He breathed a small sigh of relief, the stress of the fire beginning to fade. His heart felt heavy, yet hopeful, caught between his responsibility to protect strangers from danger and his growing desire to protect Helen from the pain inflicted by her own family. Duty and heart. He was split between both, unsure how to reconcile the two. But he knew, deep down, that he wouldn't abandon either. A few nights after the warehouse fire, Jesse found himself walking through the corridors of a community center in an older part of Boston. The area was far from the polished suburbs where Helen lived. Paint peeled from some of the building's walls, and flickering fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Still, there was an energy in the air. Children's laughter echoed from a distant room, and volunteers bustled about, organizing supplies for a local food drive. Helen had asked him to meet her there. She wanted to learn more about volunteer opportunities, legal aid clinics, and other ways she might reconnect with her earlier aspirations of helping others. He found her in a small office, seated at a makeshift desk with piles of pamphlets. She wore a casual sweater and jeans, looking surprisingly relaxed compared to the glossy corporate attire she often sported. When he entered, she glanced up and beamed. "Hey, I'm so glad you came." He took in the sight of her rifling through stacks of legal aid flyers. "I'm impressed," he said, stepping closer. "Didn't think your father's circle would appreciate you hanging out here." She shrugged, a determined glint in her eyes. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'm done letting my father's opinions run my life. If I want to get involved with pro bono work, I should at least start by seeing what's out there." Jesse nodded, admiring her conviction. He was also aware that this step was more than just a professional choice. It was a statement of independence. "Need any help?" he offered. Helen handed him a set of folders. "Yes, please. Can you alphabetize these?" "They're applications for clients who need representation in housing disputes." They worked quietly for a while, sorting and categorizing. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and a warm undercurrent passed between them, an unspoken recognition that they shared a mutual purpose beyond mere conversation. A tall woman with braided hair, dressed in a modest blouse and skirt, poked her head in. "Helen, hi, I'm Cynthia, the coordinator here." "Good to meet you in person." Helen smiled, introducing Jesse. "This is Cynthia Rose. She's been giving me a crash course in how the center operates. Cynthia, this is Jesse Brown." Cynthia greeted him politely, then focused on Helen. "We'd love your expertise for a few landlord-tenant disputes if you're up for it. Nothing major, just some folks who need legal advice to avoid eviction." Helen's eyes sparkled with eager resolve. Absolutely. I'd be happy to help. Let me wrap up here and we can talk details. With a nod, Cynthia left, and Helen turned back to Jessie, enthusiasm lighting up her face. This is what I've been missing, feeling like I'm making a real difference. He returned her smile. Sounds like a big change from corporate law. Helen's gaze flickered momentarily with concern. Yes, and it might come at a cost. My father sees pro bono work as charity cases that don't boost the family's standing. Eric thinks it's a waste of my professional capital, but I can't keep living by their rules. Jessie set down a folder, stepping nearer to her. Change can be hard, he said quietly, but you're rediscovering what matters to you. That's something worth fighting for. She hesitated, as though weighing whether to voice her next thought. Speaking of fighting, I told Eric I need time before setting any wedding date. He didn't take it well, Jessie nodded, tension creeping into his shoulders at the mention of Eric. Did he threaten you again? Helen averted her gaze. Not explicitly, but he made it clear that my father has invested a lot in this alliance, as they call it. He even said that if I walk away, I can't expect the same social or financial safety net I've always had. Jessie felt a surge of protective instinct. You don't need their safety net. You're strong enough to stand on your own. She gave him a soft, grateful smile. Thank you. My biggest concern is how all this stress might push Dad to dig more into your life, your career. I don't want you caught in the crossfire. He took a moment to steady himself. I've been warned that Charles is snooping around, but I can handle it. They were interrupted by a child's voice echoing in the hallway. Miss Cynthia, are you coming back? A little boy peered through the doorway, eyes wide with curiosity at the sight of Helen and Jessie. Helen laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that lit her face in a way Jessie hadn't seen before. We'll be right there, she called. Soon after, Cynthia returned, whisking Helen into a discussion about upcoming legal workshops. Jessie watched from the sidelines, a sense of admiration warming him from within. This was Helen pursuing something that resonated with her soul, unencumbered by her father's ambitions or Eric's demands. When they finally finished, the center's lights were dimming. Jessie escorted Helen out to her car, a modest chin she'd purchased after the accident, refusing Eric's offer of a luxury replacement. The crisp air greeted them as they stepped onto the nearly empty street. I'll head home, Helen said, hugging her folders close. But thank you for helping out tonight. It means more than you know. Jessie placed a hand on her shoulder gently, mindful of her lingering injuries. I'm proud of you, and I'm here if you need anything. She nodded, eyes shining in the orange glow of the street lamp. I do need you, she admitted softly, even if just to remind me that I can choose my own path. He stepped back, letting her settle into the driver's seat. As she drove away, Jessie stood for a moment in the quiet street, reflecting on how she was building a new life, brick by brick, choice by choice. And with each step forward, he felt more determined to be the helping hand she could rely on, especially when her own family seemed so intent on pulling her back to a life that no longer fit who she was becoming. Helen's growing resolve to pursue more meaningful work brought unexpected consequences. Less than a week after she began volunteering at the community center, she received a curt message summoning her to her father's estate. Charles Campbell wanted to discuss her future, which Helen interpreted as a final warning. Despite her trepidation, she agreed to meet. She called Jessie beforehand, her voice shaking slightly. I'm going to talk to him, alone. I can't hide anymore. If I don't face him now, I'll never stand on my own. Jessie offered to accompany her, but she politely declined, explaining that she needed to confront her father herself. Still, his heart pounded in worry for her as he pictured the austere mansion and Charles's commanding presence. By the time Helen hung up, they'd agreed to meet later that evening, so she could share whatever happened. Helen arrived at the estate late in the afternoon. The massive oak doors opened to reveal a somber interior of polished floors, ornate tapestries, and the ever-present hush that seemed to envelop the Campbell family. A butler led her to her father's study, a cavernous room lined with towering bookshelves and an imposing desk at its center. Charles Campbell rose from behind the desk, eyes narrowed. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair meticulously combed back. His suit, impeccably tailored, exuded an air of authority. Linda was seated to one side, lips pressed into a thin line, while Eric hovered by the window, arms crossed. "Sit!" Charles commanded. Helen obeyed, placing her cane against the armrest of a leather chair. She could feel 3 pairs of eyes on her, assessing her every move. Charles wasted no time. "I hear you've been dabbling in volunteer work. That's fine as a pastime, but not acceptable as your primary focus, Helen. Your career is part of a larger plan." Helen clenched her jaw. "My career is my decision. I'm done following a plan I never had a say in. If I want to do pro bono work, that's my right." Eric stepped forward, face taut. "Helen, your father is trying to ensure you don't throw away your future. You have responsibilities to the firm, to our upcoming marriage." He shot her a meaningful look. "And to me," her pulse hammered, but she forced her voice to stay firm. "I'm not sure there is an upcoming marriage, Eric. Not unless you respect my choices." A chilling silence filled the room. Linda glanced away, looking as though she'd prefer to be anywhere else. Charles's eyes flashed with anger. "I forbid you from dissolving this engagement," he said, words clipped. "It is a matter of family honor now. Our name is at stake, and I will not have it dragged through the mud because of your whims." Helen steadied herself. "Your honor doesn't give you the right to live my life for me." Charles slammed a hand on the desk. "Whims? Is that what this is about? Or is it about Jesse Brown, the man who failed to protect his own brother? Are you so enamored with him that you'd humiliate this family again?" A tremor of anger shot through Helen. She stood, leaning on her cane, eyes blazing. "Stop using Todd's death as a weapon. Jesse has done nothing but show me kindness, and I won't be bullied into a marriage that only benefits your social standing." At her words, Eric let out a bitter laugh. "So you'd choose that firefighter over me?" Helen faced him, voice resolute. "I'm choosing myself. You've made it clear that our relationship is more about appearances than actual support." Charles's expression hardened, a storm of fury in his eyes. "If you walk away from this, if you choose to continue rebelling, you'll be cut off. No financial support, no family events. Don't expect your trust fund or any advantage that comes with the Campbell name." Helen felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to remember the sense of purpose she'd found at the community center, the genuine conversations with Jesse, and the growing conviction in her heart. "So be it," she said quietly, refusing to let her voice falter. She turned to Linda, who had remained silent. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Helen thought she saw a flicker of sympathy in her sister's gaze, but Linda said nothing. Without another word, Helen limped toward the door. Her cane tapped against the polished floor, echoing in the stunned silence. When she reached the hallway, she paused, breathing hard. In that moment, she realized there was no turning back. She had shattered the facade her father had so carefully crafted. That evening, Jesse waited in the same cafe where they'd once met to talk about the accident. It was quieter this time, the evening crowd dwindling. When Helen finally arrived, her face was drawn with fatigue, but a resolute light shone in her eyes. She settled into the booth across from him, and he could almost feel the weight she carried. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a kind of liberation radiated from her posture. "It's done," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "I told them all I'm out." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. She gripped his fingers tightly, as though anchoring herself to a new truth, one that would require courage, sacrifice, and perhaps a leap of faith neither of them had fully anticipated. And in that quiet moment in the cafe, they both understood they were stepping toward something unknown, guided only by a shared resolve to seek the truth, no matter the cost. Helen woke the next morning with a mixture of conviction and unease. She had boldly challenged her father, Charles, and effectively put her engagement to Eric on indefinite hold. The shockwaves of that decision rippled through every aspect of her life. Knowing she was now cut off from the family finances, she wasted no time searching for a smaller, more affordable apartment. It was a tangible first step in carving out a space that felt entirely her own. Jesse offered to help with the move. Late in the afternoon, he parked his truck in front of the upscale house Helen had once shared with Eric. Standing on the doorstep, he felt the full weight of the tension between Helen and the people inside. The front door finally opened to reveal Eric in a crisp, button-down shirt, looking as though he'd just come from the office. His jaw clenched when he saw Jesse. "She's in the living room," Eric said coldly. Without another word, he walked down the hallway, leaving Jesse to step in alone. Helen appeared, a half-packed box in her arms. She set it down with obvious relief. "I thought I could carry more than I can," she said, forcing a small smile. "But I keep forgetting my shoulder still aches." Jesse nodded sympathetically. "Let me take care of the heavy stuff." In silence, they gathered her belongings, mostly clothes, books, and personal mementos. Helen left behind most of the designer furniture and decorations that Eric had chosen. As they worked, Eric reappeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "So this is it," he said, voice tight with anger. "You're really walking away?" Helen looked up, meeting his gaze firmly. "Yes, we both know this isn't working. It's better to end it now." Eric's eyes flicked toward Jesse. "Because of him?" Helen's tone remained steady. "No, because of me. This relationship wasn't right for a long time. Jesse just helped me see that I don't have to remain trapped." Eric let out a scoff. "You're making a huge mistake." Helen ignored his jab, turning back to Jesse. She handed him the last box labeled "Personal," filled with old photographs and keepsakes. Jesse felt Eric's glare boring into his back. Before they left, Eric stopped Helen near the doorway. His voice dropped. "I hope you realize what you're losing: your security, your father's support, and your place in society." Helen lifted her chin. "I'm finding my own place." They carried the boxes out to Jesse's truck. Once everything was loaded, Helen sank into the passenger seat, tension evident in her shoulders. Neither spoke until Jesse had navigated away from the quiet, manicured neighborhood into the busier city streets. "Thank you," she said softly, staring out the window. "Eric's not usually that quiet. I think he's in shock." Jesse kept his eyes on the road. "You handled it well. Are you all right?" She exhaled a trembling breath. "I will be. I'm free. But now I have to figure out what to do with that freedom." They arrived at a modest apartment building on the other side of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and safe, and the landlord had been sympathetic to Helen's sudden need for housing. A small hallway led to a living area with windows that overlooked a bustling street corner. Boxes in hand, they climbed the stairs, setting everything down in a space that still smelled of fresh paint. Helen flicked on the overhead light, taking in the bare walls and floors. "It's not much," she said with a shaky laugh, "but it's mine." Jesse placed a comforting hand on her uninjured shoulder. "That's what matters. You'll shape it into a home soon enough." She turned to him, her eyes brimming with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I never thought I'd be starting over like this," she whispered. "But I'm strangely excited, also terrified. He understood the feeling, recalling how he'd moved into his own sparse apartment after Todd's death and his divorce from Linda. Sometimes there was freedom in the emptiness, room to rebuild without the baggage of the past. "I get it," he said softly, "but you're not alone in this." They began unpacking in companionable silence. Helen discovered old photos of her and Linda as kids, prompting a faraway look. "I wish Linda and I were closer," she murmured. "Maybe one day, but she's so tied to my father's worldview." Jesse nodded, recalling Linda's guarded expression during their recent encounters. He wondered if there was a chance for reconciliation between the sisters, or if the family rift ran too deep. By the time they finished stacking boxes against the living room wall, night had fallen. City lights twinkled through the windows, casting the apartment in a warm glow. Jesse and Helen stood near a window, shoulders almost touching, gazing out at the lively street below. "I guess this is the first real confrontation," Helen said, voice subdued. "Walking away from Eric, stepping out of my father's shadow. I know there's more to come, but this was a big step." Jesse met her eyes, sensing the surge of both fear and determination stirring inside her. "You made the right choice," he said gently, "even if it's a hard one." For a moment, they were simply two people standing together, reflecting on how one monumental decision had reshaped their lives. And though the road ahead promised to be fraught with obstacles, from Charles's backlash to the unresolved tensions around Todd's death, there was no denying the quiet power in Helen's decision to face this confrontation head-on. In the weeks that followed, Helen's new routine settled into place with surprising ease. She balanced her part-time corporate work, what was left of it, with her volunteering at the community center. Despite her father's threats, she still held her license to practice law, and a few sympathetic colleagues discreetly sent small cases her way, giving her the opportunity to build a modest client base of her own. Her evenings were quieter now. Instead of attending formal dinners with Eric or social events orchestrated by Charles, she found herself alone in her sparsely furnished apartment. On one such night, she sat cross-legged on the floor, a single lamp illuminating the room, sifting through old documents related to Todd's tragic fire. She wanted to piece together the timeline of events, understand more fully why Linda and Charles had blamed Jesse so vehemently. Photos of Todd, smiling and carefree, formed a stark contrast to the final report of the blaze. Helen's eyes traced the official statements. No evidence of negligence on the part of the first responders. Fire spread rapidly due to buildings' outdated wiring and a lack of sprinklers. She found no indication that Jesse was at fault, only references to structural hazards that had made the rescue nearly impossible. As she pored over the details, her phone buzzed. A text from Jesse. "How are you holding up tonight?" She typed back a quick reply. "Reading old reports. Trying to understand everything." His response came almost immediately. "Call me if you need to talk." Helen set the phone aside, hugging her knees to her chest. She couldn't shake the nagging sense that there was more to the story, something unspoken or hidden in the tension that still clung to Linda and Charles whenever Todd's name came up. But she also knew that the deeper she dug, the more she risked unearthing painful truths that could fracture her family beyond repair. The following afternoon, she visited the fire station on impulse, hoping Jesse might have a break. She found him in the station's gym, where he was finishing a workout, a light sheen of sweat on his brow. He gave her a warm smile that reached his eyes. "Hey," she greeted, lingering by the door. "I'm not interrupting, am I?" "Not at all," Jesse replied, setting down a dumbbell. "What's up?" She hesitated, then handed him a small folder containing copies of the fire reports. "I've been reading these. I see nothing that suggests you were at fault. So why do my father and Linda act like you let Todd die on purpose?" His expression darkened slightly. They never outright said it was on purpose. It was more that I should have done something, some miraculous feat to save Todd. He wiped his face with a towel. I was only a volunteer firefighter at the time, but I was the first on scene. By the time the professionals arrived with more resources, the fire was out of control. Helen heard the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "No one should have to carry that alone." Jesse looked at the folder in her hands, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Why are you digging into this?" She sighed, moving closer. "I'm learning that my family can twist narratives to fit their needs. I don't want to build my life on their version of the story. I want the truth." He nodded, exhaling slowly. "So do I. But the truth may not bring closure the way you think it will." Helen opened her mouth to reply, but the station's alarm blared. Jesse grabbed his gear, giving her an apologetic look as the call for an apartment fire crackled over the intercom. "I have to go," he said, pressing the folder back into her arms. "Please don't let this consume you. It's already cost us both so much." Before she could respond, he dashed off, disappearing behind the engine truck. Helen stepped aside as the firefighters hurried to their vehicles, hearts pounding, adrenaline coursing. The overhead lights flickered red in warning, and the blare of sirens echoed moments later as the engines sped out of the station. Alone, amid the organized chaos, Helen felt a rush of respect for Jesse's life on the front lines, always ready to charge into danger for others. It was a stark contrast to the calculated world of her father's business dealings, where manipulation was wielded with the same urgency Jesse used to save lives. She tucked the folder under her arm and left quietly, thoughts churning. The deeper she dove into these reports, the more she realized how complicated guilt and grief could become when intertwined with power and influence. She also recognized how fragile Jesse's sense of peace was, bound up in proving he'd done all he could to save Todd. That night, as Helen sat alone in her apartment, she sifted through more documents, determined to piece the puzzle together. She recalled Linda's cryptic comments, her father's veiled threats. A suspicion formed in the back of her mind. Perhaps the real reason they blamed Jesse was that admitting the fire was uncontrollable would also mean admitting they themselves could not have changed the outcome. Powerless in the face of tragedy, they'd needed a scapegoat. Closing the folder, Helen pressed her hands against her eyes. Weary but resolute, she had hoped these papers would provide clarity, yet they left her with deeper questions. For Jesse's sake and her own, she had to keep pushing forward, balancing the weight of the past with her newfound resolve to live openly, truthfully, even if that meant confronting the family she once believed she could never defy. Helen stood in her small kitchen, whisking eggs in a bowl while the sun streamed through the window. It was early, and the city outside was just waking up. She wasn't usually one to cook a big breakfast, but this morning felt different. She wanted to mark a new chapter in her life, a life defined by her own choices. A soft knock at the door signaled Jesse's arrival. She opened it to find him holding a small bouquet of daisies. "These seem cheerful," he said by way of greeting, stepping inside. Helen smiled, placing the flowers in a spare glass. "Thank you. It's good to see you." She motioned for him to sit, then poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. They chatted about small things first, her volunteer work, his latest rescue run, until Helen finally set down her mug. Her expression turned serious. "I need to share something with you," she began. "I've been reading every document I can find about Todd's fire, including the official reports and statements from your fellow volunteers." She paused, studying his reaction. "I keep coming to the same conclusion. You did everything you could. There was no way to save him once that structure began collapsing. So why is my family so insistent on blaming you?" Jesse's shoulders tensed. Because it's easier for them to have someone to blame if they acknowledge the uncontrollable factors. Then they have to accept Todd's death as a random tragedy. He sipped his coffee, eyes clouded with old grief. They couldn't stand the idea that sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we can't control everything. Helen leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on his forearm. Then maybe we need to show them that the truth won't destroy them. My father acts like the only options are control or chaos, but maybe if he faced the fact that no one was at fault, he could finally let Todd rest in peace. A hint of longing flickered in Jesse's gaze. I've wanted that for so long. For them to understand I loved Todd, that I would have given anything to save him. Helen nodded. Then we work toward that. I don't know if they'll listen, but we can't keep letting their narrative tear you down. They finished breakfast with a renewed sense of unity. It was as if they'd both quietly decided to stand side by side against the weight of the Campbell family's anger. After cleaning up, Helen pulled out a notepad. We should list all the evidence we have and any new leads we might pursue. Maybe there's an investigator or someone from the building's ownership who could clarify more about that night. Jesse agreed, although the process clearly made him uneasy. This is all so tied up in my own guilt. Even if I wasn't legally responsible, there's always been that voice in my head saying, you could have done something different. Helen's eyes softened. I felt something similar with my family, like if I just did what they wanted, I'd have the life they envisioned for me. But sometimes we have to let ourselves off the hook. Some things aren't our fault. They spent the next hour jotting down notes, cross-referencing times and statements. Helen noticed that as they worked, Jesse's posture gradually relaxed, as if the act of confronting the facts head-on was peeling away layers of self-doubt. Likewise, Helen felt a surge of determination. She was no longer a passive daughter or fiancée. She was an active agent in her own life and, to a degree, in Jesse's pursuit of absolution. At one point, Jesse paused, pencil in hand. This is all well and good, but Charles isn't exactly the forgiving type. Even if we present this to him, will it matter? Helen gave a small shrug. I don't know, but maybe it'll matter to Linda. She's been caught in the middle. If we can show her the truth, maybe she'll speak on our behalf. Jesse nodded, eyes fixed on the scattered papers. He allowed himself a fleeting moment of hope. Sometimes I wonder what Todd would say if he were here. He'd probably tell me to stop blaming myself and to stand up to your father once and for all. Helen smiled, blinking back sudden emotion. Then let's do that. For him and for us. The morning sun had climbed higher, filling the small apartment with warmth. Their notes lay spread out across the table, an outward sign of an inward transformation. They were no longer beholden to the fear that once defined them. Helen was no longer the dutiful daughter catering to her father's wishes, and Jesse was not merely a guilt-ridden man haunted by a tragic loss. They were two people who had come to believe in each other's worth. That belief was forging a path that neither could have walked alone, and for the first time, they both sensed that confronting the root of past tragedy might open the door to genuine healing and a future not dictated by old ghosts. A late autumn chill swept through the city, and Helen felt it acutely as she waited outside a modest law office on the south side of Boston. She wore a warm coat, her hand resting on the cane she still occasionally needed. Jesse had messaged her that he was on his way. Stuck in post-shift traffic, she glanced at her phone, heart pounding with anticipation. She was here to see an independent investigator who specialized in reviewing old fire incidents. His name was Alan Rutledge, a retired arson detective with a reputation for meticulous research. If anyone could provide clarity on Todd's fire, it might be him. Jesse finally arrived, stepping out of his truck and hurrying over. "Sorry," he said, breath visible in the cold air. "Traffic was a nightmare." "Don't worry," Helen replied, her voice tight with nerves. "Let's go in." They walked into the building's lobby and took a creaky elevator to the third floor. Outside Rutledge's office, Helen steadied herself. "No going back now," she said softly, shooting Jesse a determined look. Inside, they found a cramped waiting area with outdated furniture. A cheerful assistant guided them to Rutledge's office, a small space packed with filing cabinets and stacks of folders. The investigator, a lean man in his early 60s, rose to greet them. Rutledge motioned for them to sit. "I'm familiar with the general details of the Todd Brown case," he said, donning wire-rimmed glasses. "A tragic event. You said you had documents you wanted me to review." Helen handed over a folder containing the key reports, testimonies, and data gleaned from city records. While Rutledge flipped through the pages, his sharp gaze darted from one piece of evidence to the next. Jesse and Helen sat in tense silence, exchanging worried glances. "Have you noticed anything suspicious so far?" Jesse finally asked, voice subdued. Rutledge tapped a line of text with his pen. "Nothing that suggests arson or foul play, if that's what you mean. The official cause was electrical overload plus faulty wiring. It all escalated very quickly." Helen exhaled, somewhat relieved. "That's consistent with what we've seen. We just need a professional opinion that it was uncontrollable, that no first responder could have done more." Rutledge removed his glasses, leaning back. "Based on what I'm seeing, if you were the first on scene, Jesse, and the building was already engulfed, there was little you could do. The structure wasn't up to code, which explains why it collapsed so fast." Jesse's shoulders sagged as if he'd been holding tension for years. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Helen rested a hand on his arm. "So this confirms what we already believed. But will it change anything for my family?" Rutledge offered a sympathetic smile. "I'm just an investigator, not a therapist, but these findings clearly show no individual was at fault, neither the victim nor the responders." They thanked him, gathering their materials. On the way out, Rutledge added, "If you need an official statement, I can draft something and have it notarized. It might help if you're facing any legal or reputational threats." Helen nodded gratefully, promising to follow up. Outside in the hallway, she and Jesse paused, looking at each other with cautious relief. "We have a solid expert opinion now," she said. "This might help convince Linda or even my father, if he'll listen." Jesse slipped a protective arm around her shoulders, mindful of her still sore side. "It won't bring Todd back, but maybe it'll close a chapter of blame." They descended the stairs, the echo of their footsteps matching the unspoken hopes in their hearts. Later, they climbed back into Jesse's truck, letting the engine warm up as they watched light flakes of snow dance in the streetlights. It felt like the city was shifting seasons right before their eyes, mirroring their own transition toward confronting the past with new clarity. As they drove through the dusky streets, Helen thought about the next step, presenting these findings to her family. She dreaded facing her father's disapproval, but the knowledge that Jesse could finally have official confirmation of his innocence spurred her on. Eventually, they pulled up to Helen's apartment. She turned to Jesse. "We should reach out to Linda first, don't you think? She's more likely to read the report before Dad will—" Jesse considered it, his jaw tight. "Yeah, Linda might at least look at the evidence calmly, even if she's still conflicted." Helen leaned across the truck's console, resting her hand lightly on his. "You ready for this? It could get messy." He managed a small smile. "I've lived under this cloud for so long. I'm ready for some clarity." "Let's do it." They parted with a lingering hug, and Helen carried the weight of that meeting with Rutledge into her apartment. The dryness in her throat wasn't from the winter air, but from the anxiety roiling in her stomach. She was about to confront her sister, and by extension, her entire family's narrative about Todd. It was a significant undertaking, but it was also a chance for Jesse to shed the guilt that had haunted him. Tomorrow, she would call Linda. And soon, all of them would sit down face to face with the report in hand. It was the final step in a long journey toward the truth. Whatever the outcome, Helen was determined to give Jesse the vindication he deserved and to reclaim her own power in the process. A bitter wind whipped through the Campbell estate's sprawling grounds as Helen and Jesse made their way up the long driveway. The mansion loomed before them, its grand columns and carefully manicured hedges exuding a cold majesty. Helen's stomach twisted with apprehension. This was the same place she had defiantly left weeks ago, carrying a single suitcase and a shattered engagement. Linda had arranged a meeting in the grand parlor, convincing Charles to at least hear Helen out. She told Helen on the phone that their father was guarded, but curious. Eric, however, had refused to attend. He had no interest in rehashing the past, especially since his engagement to Helen was all but dissolved. A quiet part of Helen felt relieved by his absence. Inside, the parlor was large enough to host a banquet, with polished floors and an ornate chandelier that cast shimmering patterns across the walls. Charles Campbell stood by the fireplace, his posture ramrod straight. Linda waited near the piano, eyes flicking from Jesse to Helen. The tension was palpable, like a current humming beneath the surface of polite silence. Helen cleared her throat, voice quivering only slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to see us. We won't take much of your time." Charles didn't respond. He turned sharply to face them. "Speak, then." Taking a deep breath, Helen handed Linda a copy of Rutledge's report. She'd already emailed it, but she wanted the physical pages present, tangible proof. "This comes from an independent investigator, someone with decades of experience. It confirms that the fire was due to faulty wiring and structural neglect. No first responder could have saved Todd." Charles glanced at the document, his jaw tightening. "We already had the official reports, did we not?" "Yes," Helen said, voice firmer now. "But this expert opinion reinforces that no single person was to blame, and certainly not Jesse." She tilted her head toward Jesse, who stood quietly, his eyes never leaving Charles. Linda stepped closer, scanning the report. Helen caught her sister's slight frown, as though wrestling with the conflict of loyalties that had always dogged her. Finally, Linda looked up, meeting Jesse's gaze. "I see no reason to doubt these findings. It appears we may have overreacted." Charles's face hardened further. "That changes nothing. My son is dead, and this man was there when it happened." Jesse finally spoke, his tone steady but filled with years of suppressed grief. "I loved Todd. He was my brother. Do you think I wouldn't have saved him if I'd had the power to? My entire life since that night has been about trying to atone for something I couldn't control." For a moment, Charles's composure faltered. His eyes flicked from the report to Jesse's face. "You were reckless. You went in too soon, without waiting for a full crew. That building was a death trap." "Yes," Jesse said softly. "I did go in, because I couldn't wait knowing Todd was there. But it was already too late. The fire spread and the roof collapsed. You can't imagine how many times I've replayed that moment in my head." Helen stepped in, speaking directly to her father. "You've clung to blame because accepting the randomness of it is more painful, isn't it? It means Todd's death wasn't preventable by wealth or status or any of the power you're so proud of." Charles's eyes blazed. "You dare lecture me in my own home?" Helen swallowed hard but held her ground. "I dare, because I'm done letting fear rule our family. We lost Todd. We lost a chance to grieve together because we were too busy blaming Jesse." Linda moved beside Helen, uncharacteristically quiet. Slowly, she placed a hand on Helen's shoulder, a small but meaningful gesture of support. Her eyes flickered to Charles, then to Jesse, and finally back to the report. "Dad, maybe we've carried this anger for too long. It won't bring Todd back." The old man's shoulders sagged slightly. He looked at the fireplace, his profile etched with bitterness and sorrow. "I loved my son, and then he was gone. The only comfort I had was the story that it was someone's fault." Jesse's heart clenched. He'd never seen Charles anything but steely and domineering. Now, the older man looked heartbreakingly human. "I'm sorry," Jesse said quietly. "I can't bring him back, but I hope you can forgive me for not doing the impossible." A strained hush fell over the room. The crackle of the fireplace was the only sound. Finally, Charles exhaled, a tremor passing through him. "I don't know if I can forgive," he said, voice raw, "but I understand now." It was neither full absolution nor a warm reconciliation, but it was a crack in the wall of hostility that had long separated Jesse from the Campbell family. Helen saw it as a beginning, however small, of a possible healing. After a tense moment, Charles walked out, the echo of his footsteps trailing down the corridor. Linda followed him, leaving Jesse and Helen alone in the sprawling parlor. Relief and exhaustion washed over Helen like a tidal wave. She turned to Jesse, tears brimming in her eyes. "It wasn't everything we hoped," she whispered, "but it's something." Jesse nodded, his own throat tight. "That's more than I ever thought we'd get." They moved to the foyer, the confrontation still reverberating in their hearts. Through the tall windows, Helen glimpsed the fading light of day. Outside, dusk was settling over the estate, a symbol, perhaps, that one chapter was closing. And though the finality of Todd's loss still ached, for the first time in years, Jesse and Helen felt a step closer to genuine peace. They had faced the greatest obstacle, her father's unyielding blame, and emerged with a fragile and tentative hope that the wounds of the past could someday mend. A week after the tense confrontation at the Campbell estate, Helen found herself back at her apartment, curled up on a small love seat she'd purchased second-hand. She gazed through the window at the bustling street below, recalling her father's pained expression when he finally seemed to acknowledge that Jesse was not to blame for Todd's death. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was the closest to acceptance she had ever witnessed in Charles Campbell. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She leaned forward and saw Linda's name on the screen. Tentatively, Helen answered, half expecting another lecture. Linda's tone was subdued, almost cautious. "Hi, I wanted to see how you're doing." Helen took a breath. "I'm all right. A bit tired, I guess. What about you?" A pause. Then Linda let out a quiet sigh. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how Dad and I used Todd's death as a shield against reality. We were so angry, so hurt, that we latched onto Jesse to make sense of our pain. Seeing Dad finally soften, even just a little, made me realize I owe both of you an apology." Helen felt her throat tighten. In all the years since Todd died, Linda had never once admitted fault. "You don't have to." "Yes," Linda interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "I do, and I know words alone aren't enough, but for what it's worth, I'm sorry." Helen closed her eyes, letting the sentiment sink in. "I appreciate that. Truly." They spoke a while longer, and Linda mentioned that Charles had been quiet since the meeting, more withdrawn than usual. He hadn't explicitly reversed his decision to cut Helen off financially, but Linda hinted that he was rethinking some of his harsher stances. Helen found herself feeling oddly protective of her father now that she knew how deep his grief truly ran. "Maybe it's a process," Helen offered. "He needs time to reconcile everything," Linda agreed, then changed the subject. "Have you talked to Jesse? How's he holding up after finally hearing Dad admit there was no fault on his part?" Helen pictured Jesse's gentle smile, I think it gave him a sense of relief, but it also stirred up emotions he'd kept buried. He's been quieter lately, more reflective. She paused, fiddling with a loose thread on her couch. But we're close. Closer than I expected. Linda was silent for a moment, then said in a subdued tone, "He's a good man, Helen. I see that now. I wish I'd seen it sooner." By the time the call ended, Helen felt a warmth in her chest, an openness she hadn't experienced in her family before. It wasn't a tidy resolution, but it was a step toward healing wounds that had festered for too long. Shortly after hanging up, she heard a knock on her door. She opened it to find Jesse standing there, a faint smile on his face. "Hey," he said, stepping inside. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd check on you." She gestured for him to come in. "You must have read my mind. Linda just called." His eyebrows rose. "How'd that go?" Helen led him to the couch, where she recounted the conversation. Jesse listened, relief evident in his posture. "That's good," he said quietly. "A real apology from Linda." "Didn't think I'd see the day." Helen tilted her head. "She seems genuine. I think even she's realizing life is too short to harbor resentments. She asked how you were doing." Jesse's expression softened. "I'm okay. Feels strange not having that constant blame looming over me, like I should be looking over my shoulder, waiting for another accusation." He exhaled a slow breath. "But I'm trying to accept what happened, both the tragedy and now the slight shift in your father's stance." Helen reached for his hand, entwining her fingers with his. "You deserve peace, Jesse." Their hands remained linked for a moment, the silence conveying more than words. Although their relationship was still unfolding, there was a shared understanding that they'd weathered a storm together, one that had tested their resilience and uncovered vulnerabilities neither had fully acknowledged before. Jesse eventually cleared his throat, glancing at the box of documents on Helen's small dining table. "Are you still helping out at the community center next week?" She nodded. "Yeah, the pro bono cases are piling up. It's overwhelming, but in a good way. Feels like a place where I can make a real impact." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You're doing something meaningful, Helen. Don't forget that." They fell into a light-hearted conversation about the center, about Jesse's latest shift at the station, and about the simple day-to-day details that made life feel normal. Outside, the autumn sun cast shifting patterns on the windowpane, a subtle reminder that seasons were changing. Helen offered him a cup of tea, and they settled side by side, letting the peaceful moment wash over them. For all the upheaval and the difficult confrontations, here they were, sharing an ordinary afternoon that felt extraordinary simply because they could finally breathe free of blame. In the stillness, Helen sensed that while the scars were real, she and Jesse had found a new perspective, one where past tragedy did not dictate their future paths. Jesse's life at the fire station settled into a familiar rhythm, but it no longer carried the same undertone of guilt. On a crisp morning, he stood by the gleaming red engine, polishing the metal fittings while chatting with Marco, the rookie who had always looked up to him. "You seem different," Marco remarked, leaning on a nearby tool rack. "Lighter, I guess." Jesse paused, considering the comment. "I suppose I am. Things are starting to make sense." He thought about how Captain Warren had taken him aside earlier that week, quietly acknowledging the change in his demeanor. "You're calmer, more focused," Warren had said approvingly. "That's the Jesse I always knew was there." Later that day, as Jesse finished his shift, a text from Helen flashed across his phone. "Come by the new legal clinic at the community center if you can. I want to show you something." Curiosity piqued. Jesse drove over. The community center bustled with activity, children running down the halls, volunteers organizing a food drive, and a queue of people waiting for free legal consultation. When he finally spotted Helen, She was in a makeshift office, partitioned by thin curtains. She wore a simple blouse and black pants, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Despite the faint lines of fatigue under her eyes, she radiated purpose. He waited until she finished advising a client, then slipped through the curtain. "This place is packed," he observed, smiling. "Didn't realize so many people needed help." Helen rubbed her temples, sounding both proud and overwhelmed. "It's incredible and a bit heartbreaking. But I'm glad to be here. Let me introduce you to someone." She led him into a small side room that had been outfitted with donated furniture. A tall, middle-aged woman with a kind face rose from behind a desk. "Sarah Johnson," the woman said, offering her hand to Jesse. "I'm one of the coordinators." Helen explained that Sarah had helped her set up a formal clinic within the center. With Helen's expertise and a few other volunteer lawyers, they hoped to handle everything from eviction notices to minor criminal defense cases. "Eventually," Helen added, "we want to expand into family law issues, especially for women who need protection orders or custody help." Jesse looked around, impressed by the organized chaos. "You're really building something here." Helen's eyes sparkled. "I want to offer people in crisis a safe place to seek justice. That's what law should be about, right? Empowering the powerless." He nodded, feeling a surge of admiration. "I think Todd would be proud." She blinked, and a soft smile curved her lips. "Thank you for saying that." Over the next hour, Jesse watched Helen consult with various community members. She explained legalese in plain language, comforted those who were anxious, and even coaxed a smile from a tearful single mother facing eviction. It reminded him of the rescue work he did as a firefighter, two different professions, yet both driven by a desire to protect and uplift. When her shift ended, they stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. A mild breeze stirred the fallen leaves near the entrance. "This ordinary routine feels good, doesn't it?" Jesse asked, offering her an arm to lean on as they walked across the parking lot. Helen linked her arm through his. "Yes. Sometimes I can't believe how much my life has changed, but for once it feels like I'm living on my own terms." They paused by his truck, the amber sunlight catching the strands of Helen's hair. Jesse reached out to brush a leaf off her shoulder. "You've come a long way, from that hospital bed to challenging your father, to launching this legal clinic." She glanced down, almost shyly. "I had help, you know." A warm silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken gratitude and lingering tenderness. Jesse knew that the road ahead might still hold family disputes or unexpected hurdles. Yet, standing here with Helen, he felt profoundly at peace. "Your father's estate, your old world, that was normal for so long," he said quietly. "But this is your new ordinary, and it suits you better." Helen squeezed his arm. "It does, and it suits us. We're both still doing what we do best, helping people in different ways." A bus rumbled by, sending a gust of warm air over them. People hurried in and out of the center, each with their own struggles and hopes. Jesse and Helen watched them for a moment, acknowledging the quiet heroism that often goes unnoticed in everyday life. Finally, Helen turned to him, a gentle determination in her gaze. "We should go celebrate," she said. "No big fancy dinners, just a simple meal somewhere cozy. What do you say?" Jesse smiled, heart light. "That sounds perfect." They climbed into his truck, pulling away from the community center, letting the comfort of a renewed ordinary life guide them forward. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, Helen caught sight of the building's worn brick facade, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She and Jesse had each found a calling that aligned with their true selves, and no matter what challenges might arise, they had established a new normal, one driven by compassion, understanding, and a humble acceptance of life's fragility. The following Saturday, Helen organized a small workshop at the community center for local women interested in legal advice. The turnout surpassed her expectations. 20 or more women of varying ages filled the cramped multi-purpose room, eager to learn about tenant rights, basic contract law, and personal safety measures. She enlisted a few fellow lawyers to help answer individual questions after the session. Jesse arrived halfway through, quietly slipping into a seat near the back. He watched Helen lead the discussion with calm expertise, demystifying complex legal terms. The passion in her voice was palpable, and he found himself grinning, proud of the confident woman she had become. When the workshop ended, a few attendees lingered to thank Helen. One middle-aged woman offered a tearful hug, explaining that she'd been on the brink of eviction until Helen's guidance led her to a resource that bought her time to arrange a payment plan. The gratitude in the woman's face moved Helen deeply, and she waved goodbye with misty eyes. Jesse joined her, weaving through folding chairs scattered across the room. "That was impressive," he said, lowering his voice. "You really connected with them." Helen blinked away tears. "It's one thing to study law in school, focusing on high-stakes corporate cases, but seeing how a simple explanation can save someone's home, it feels like genuine lawyering. This is the work I've always wanted to do." They spent the next hour cleaning up, stacking chairs, gathering leftover flyers, and collecting contact information for future assistance. A handful of volunteer paralegals helped too, chatting amicably with Jesse about his firefighting experiences. He spoke of the adrenaline rush of responding to calls, but also the quiet satisfaction of routine checks that prevented emergencies before they started. Later, as dusk fell, the remaining volunteers left one by one. Helen and Jesse found themselves alone in the empty room, the hum of overhead lights providing a soothing backdrop. She leaned against a table, her cane resting beside her, shoulders heavy with fatigue and fulfillment. "You must be exhausted," Jesse commented, noticing the shadow under her eyes. Helen brushed hair from her face. "A good exhaustion. The kind that tells me I'm doing something worthwhile." He nodded. "I know the feeling, like when we finish a tough rescue and realize we've saved people from what could have been devastating." She gave him a grateful look, then changed the subject. "I had a call from Linda earlier. She asked if she could stop by tomorrow, maybe see the clinic for herself." Jesse's eyebrows rose. "Really? That's great. Is she genuinely interested?" Helen picked up her cane, fiddling with the handle. "I think so. She mentioned wanting to do more pro bono work too. She said it might be a way to balance the scales in her life." Jesse considered it. People can change. I never expected to hear Linda talk about balancing scales in a moral sense, but maybe your father's partial admission opened a door for her. Helen sighed, her expression a mix of hope and caution. "I want to believe that." She also hinted Dad isn't as combative as he was. He's apparently retreated into his own thoughts, trying to grapple with everything. Maybe that's the start of acceptance. They carried their conversation outdoors, locking the community center behind them. A brisk wind swept along the street, ruffling Helen's hair. Jesse gently placed a supportive arm around her, mindful of her lingering injury. She didn't need the cane as much these days, but the cold made her joints ache. They strolled toward a nearby coffee shop, passing quiet storefronts with dimly lit displays. The city's weekend pace felt leisurely, the sidewalks less crowded than usual. Every step they took reinforced how far they had both come, from a lonely, guilt-haunted firefighter and a conflicted attorney trapped by familial expectations, to two individuals forging a path of sincere, purpose-driven lives. Inside the coffee shop, warm light and the scent of fresh pastries enveloped them. They found a small table in a corner and ordered hot chocolate, a welcome treat against the chill outside. Helen rubbed her hands around the ceramic mug, thinking aloud about new legal workshops and more advanced classes she could offer at the center. Jessie listened intently, occasionally chiming in with suggestions for safety presentations or emergency preparedness sessions. "You know," Helen said, her voice thoughtful, "we're in a position to share what we've learned. Not just the technical skills, but the emotional journey, letting people know it's okay to break free from old narratives." Jesse nodded, recalling his own struggles with Todd's memory. And that sometimes it takes confronting the hardest truths to find genuine freedom. They lingered there for a while, sipping warm chocolate, letting the quiet space of the shop cradle their deeper reflections. Every so often, their eyes met, and a smile passed between them that needed no words. They had shared anger, sorrow, and awakening, and now a sense of rebuilding, both for themselves and for others. Helen glanced at Jessie's hand on the table, then placed hers atop it in a gentle, steady gesture. "Let's keep sharing what we've learned. Let's keep helping people find hope in dark places." He turned his palm to clasp hers. "I'm in," he answered simply. The hum of the coffee shop around them was a small backdrop to a broader transformation each had undergone. And as they finished their drinks, it felt like the ideas they were planting, both in their own hearts and in the community, would continue to grow, nourished by the hard-won lessons they now carried. The day dawned crisp and bright, with sunshine cutting through the early winter chill. Jessie headed to the local firehouse first thing in the morning, dropping off homemade muffins Helen had baked for the crew, a small token of gratitude for their support during his personal battles. Marco beamed at the sight of the treats, and Warren clapped Jessie on the shoulder, his approving silence speaking volumes. With that errand complete, Jessie drove across town to Helen's apartment. He found her standing in the doorway, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans. She looked at him with a smile that came from a place of genuine contentment. "Ready?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. He nodded. "As I'll ever be. How about you?" They gathered a few items, paperwork, a laptop, and a couple of legal folders. Today was the official opening of the expanded legal clinic at the community center. They planned a small ceremony, inviting local officials and a handful of donors who believed in the cause. Helen was to give a short speech, something she'd been nervous about all week. On the drive over, Helen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "Linda," she murmured, looking at Jessie. "I should answer." "Go for it," he encouraged, keeping his eyes on the road. Helen put the call on speaker. "Hi, Linda." "You on your way?" Linda's voice sounded calm, almost eager. "Yes, I'll be there soon. I'm bringing a friend from my firm who's interested in pro bono work. Is that okay?" Helen exchanged a glance with Jessie, smiling. "That's more than okay." They arrived at the community center to find the main hall abuzz with energy. Rows of chairs were set up facing a small podium. Posters on the walls featured uplifting messages about legal rights and community empowerment. Volunteers hurried around, making final adjustments. Jessie spied a refreshment table in one corner, laden with coffee urns and pastries donated by a local bakery. Helen introduced Jessie to a few colleagues, then slipped away to greet Linda, who arrived moments later. Linda wore a charcoal suit, but her posture was more relaxed than usual. She embraced Helen briefly, a show of affection that would have been unthinkable not long ago. "I'm proud of you," Linda whispered before pulling back. "This is important." Helen blinked away the sudden sting of tears. "Thank you. I'm glad you're here." Jessie watched from a distance, heart warmed by the sight of the two sisters finding their footing in a new, more supportive relationship. He recalled how differently this scene might have played out a few months ago, filled with tension instead of encouragement. A local councilwoman opened the ceremony with a few words about community resilience, then handed the microphone to Helen. She stood at the podium, cane resting discreetly by her side. Her gaze swept the room, pausing on Jesse for a moment, drawing strength from his presence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but sincere. She spoke of her desire to create a space where people could seek legal help without fear or financial burden, where knowledge was shared freely. She described how personal tragedies and family struggles had shaped her passion for justice. There was no melodrama, only earnest truth. As Helen's speech drew to a close, Jesse noticed Charles Campbell standing quietly at the back of the hall. Dressed in a dark overcoat, he was partially obscured by a group of onlookers. Jesse's chest tightened. He hadn't expected Charles to appear, not after everything. He wondered if Helen was aware of her father's presence. Helen ended her speech with a gracious nod. The audience applauded warmly, volunteers beaming in her direction. She stepped down from the podium, and Linda approached, offering praise. That was when Helen's eyes fell on Charles. She froze momentarily, then squared her shoulders. Charles navigated through the small crowd, hesitating a few steps away. "I heard about the clinic," he said, voice subdued. "Thought I'd see it for myself." Helen exhaled a steadying breath. "Well, thank you for coming." He scanned the room, taking in the posters, the line of people waiting for consultations. "You're doing something worthwhile," he said, the words emerging slowly. "Your mother, she would have been proud of this, I think." Emotion flickered across Helen's features. She reached for the cane, more for comfort than necessity. "Maybe so. I like to believe that." They didn't hug or exchange grand gestures, but something shifted in their presence, a quiet acknowledgement that, while the past remained heavy, they could coexist with mutual respect. Linda looked on, lips pressed together in a semblance of relief. Jesse quietly made his way over. He nodded politely at Charles, who gave a curt nod in return. It wasn't warm acceptance, but it also wasn't open hostility. In Charles's guarded expression, Jesse sensed a man still wrestling with remorse and pride, yet taking a step, however small, toward understanding. Helen caught Jesse's eye, and a grateful smile curved her lips. He returned it, his heart brimming with a mixture of hope and amazement at how drastically life could change when people confronted pain head-on. As the ceremony wound down, volunteers guided attendees to informational tables. Linda introduced her colleague to Helen, explaining how they might collaborate on more pro bono cases. The hum of conversation filled the air, a symphony of possibility in a place once overshadowed by old resentments. Eventually, Jesse and Helen found a quiet corner, away from the crowd. She leaned against him for a moment, eyes shining with both pride and humility. He wrapped an arm around her waist, steadying them both. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she corrected softly, her gaze taking in everyone around them, Linda, Charles, the volunteers, and the new faces seeking help. "We did it. All of us, in our own ways." She rested her head against Jesse's shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her breath. The center buzzed with optimism, the faint notes of renewed resolve weaving through every conversation. Outside, the winter sun cast soft light against the windows, illuminating the new bonds that had formed. Among a family once broken by grief, between two souls learning to trust again, and within a community ready to embrace a second chance at hope. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.